It is thought that Confucius was born on September 28, 551 BCE, in Zhou, in modern Shandong province. The area was notionally controlled by the kings of Zhou but effectively independent under the local lords of Lu, who ruled from the nearby city of Kufu. His father Konghe or Shulianghe was an elderly commandant of the local Lu garrison. His ancestry traced back through the dukes of Song to the Shang dynasty which had preceded the Zhou. Traditional accounts of Confucius's life relate that Konghe's grandfather had migrated the family from Song to Lu. Konghe died when Confucius was 3 years old, and Confucius was raised by his mother Yan Zhengzai in poverty. His mother would later die at less than 40 years of age. At age 19 he married Qigang, and a year later the couple had their first child, their son Kongli. Qigang and Confucius would later have 2 daughters together, one of whom is thought to have died as a child. Confucius was educated at schools for commoners, where he studied and learned the 6 arts. Confucius was born into the class of Shi, between the aristocracy and the common people. He is said to have worked in various government jobs during his early 20s, and as a bookkeeper and a caretaker of sheep and horses, using the proceeds to give his mother a proper burial. When his mother died, Confucius, aged 23, is said to have mourned for 3 years, as was the tradition. Political career in Confucius's time, the state of Lu was headed by a ruling ducal house. Under the duke were 3 aristocratic families, whose heads bore the title of Viscount and held hereditary positions in the Lu bureaucracy. The Ji family held the position, Minister over the Masses, who was also the Prime Minister. The Meng family held the position, Minister of Works, and the Shu family held the position, Minister of War. In the winter of 505 BCE, Yang Hu, a retainer of the Ji family, rose up in rebellion and seized power from the Ji family. However, by the summer of 501 BCE, the 3 hereditary families had succeeded in expelling Yang Hu from Lu. By then, Confucius had built up a considerable reputation through his teachings, while the families came to see the value of proper conduct and righteousness, so they could achieve loyalty to a legitimate government. Thus, that year 501 BCE, Confucius came to be appointed to the minor position of governor of a town. Eventually, he rose to the position of Minister of Crime. Confucius desired to return the authority of the state to the duke by dismantling the fortifications of the city, strongholds belonging to the 3 families. This way, he could establish a centralized government. However, Confucius relied solely on diplomacy as he had no military authority himself. In 500 BCE, Hu Fan, the governor of Hu, revolted against his lord of the Shu family. Although the Meng and Shu families unsuccessfully besieged Hu, a loyalist official rose up with the people of Hu and forced Hu Fan to flee to the Qi state. The situation may have been in favor for Confucius, as this likely made it possible for Confucius and his disciples to convince the aristocratic families to dismantle the fortifications of their cities. Eventually, after a year and a half, Confucius and his disciples succeeded in convincing the Shu family to raise the walls of Hu, the Ji family in raising the walls of Bai, and the Meng family in raising the walls of Cheng. First, the Shu family led an army towards their city Hu and tore down its walls in 498 BCE. Soon thereafter, Gongshan Furav, also known as Gongshan Banu, a retainer of the Ji family, revolted and took control of the forces at Bai. He immediately launched an attack and entered the capital Lu. Earlier, Gongshan had approached Confucius to join him, which Confucius considered as he wanted the opportunity to put his principles into practice, but he gave up on the idea in the end. Confucius disapproved the use of a violent revolution by principle, even though the Ji family dominated the Lu state by force for generations and had exiled the previous duke. Creel 1949 states that, unlike the rebel Yang Hu before him, Gongshan may have sought to destroy the 3 hereditary families and restore the power of the duke. However, Dubs 1946 is of the view that Gongshan was encouraged by Viscount Ji Hun to invade the Lu capital in an attempt to avoid dismantling the Bai fortified walls. Whatever the situation may have been, Gongshan was considered an upright man who continued to defend the state of Lu, even after he was forced to flee. During the revolt by Gongshan, Zhongyu had managed to keep the duke and the three viscounts together at the court. Zhongyu was one of the disciples of Confucius, and Confucius had arranged for him to be given the position of governor by the Ji family. When Confucius heard of the raid, he requested that Viscount Ji Hung allow the duke and his court to retreat to a stronghold on his palace grounds. Thereafter, the heads of the three families and the duke retreated to the Ji's palace complex and ascended the Wuzi terrace. Confucius ordered two officers to lead an assault against the rebels. At least one of the two officers was a retainer of the Ji family, but they were unable to refuse the orders while in the presence of the duke, viscounts, and court. The rebels were pursued and defeated at Jiu. Immediately after the revolt was defeated, the Ji family razed the Bai city walls to the ground. The attackers retreated after realizing that they would have to become rebels against the state and their lord. Through Confucius' actions, the Bai officials had inadvertently revolted against their own lord, thus forcing Viscount Ji Wan's hand in having to dismantle the walls of Bai, as it could have harbored such rebels or confessed to instigating the event by going against proper conduct and righteousness as an official. Dubs 1949 suggests that the incident brought to light Confucius' foresight, practical political ability, and insight into human character. When it was time to dismantle the city walls of the Meng family, the governor was reluctant to have his city walls torn down and convinced the head of the Meng family not to do so. The Zuozhong recalls that the governor advised against razing the walls to the ground as he said that it made Cheng vulnerable to the Qi state and caused the destruction of the Meng family. Even though Viscount Meng Yi gave his word not to interfere with an attempt, he went back on his earlier promise to dismantle the walls. Later in 498 BCE, Duke Ding personally went with an army to lay siege to Cheng in an attempt to raze its walls to the ground, but he did not succeed. Thus, Confucius could not achieve the idealistic reforms that he wanted, including restoration of the legitimate rule of the duke. He had made powerful enemies within the state, especially with Viscount Ji Hung, due to his successes so far. According to accounts in the Zuozhong and Shiji, Confucius departed his homeland in 497 BCE after his support for the failed attempt of dismantling the fortified city walls of the powerful Ji, Meng, and Shu families. He left the state of Lu without resigning, remaining in self-exile and unable to return as long as Viscount Ji Hung was alive. The Shiji stated that the neighboring Qi state was worried that Lu was becoming too powerful while Confucius was involved in the government of the Lu state. According to this account, Qi decided to sabotage Lu's reforms by sending 100 good horses and 80 beautiful dancing girls to the Duke of Lu. The Duke indulged himself in pleasure and did not attend to official duties for 3 days. Confucius was disappointed and resolved to leave Lu and seek better opportunities, yet to leave at once would expose the misbehavior of the Duke and therefore bring public humiliation to the ruler Confucius was serving. Confucius therefore waited for the Duke to make a lesser mistake. Soon after, the Duke neglected to send to Confucius a portion of the sacrificial meat that was his due according to custom, and Confucius seized upon this pretext to leave both his post and the Lu state. After Confucius's resignation, he began a long journey or set of journeys around the principality states of northeast and central China including Wei, Song, Zheng, Cao, Chu, Qi, Chen, and Kai, and a failed attempt to go to Jin. At the courts of these states, he expounded his political beliefs but did not see them implemented. Return home. According to the Zuozhong, Confucius returned home to his native Lu when he was 68, after he was invited to do so by Ji Kengzi, the chief minister of Lu. The Analects depict him spending his last years teaching 72 or 77 disciples and transmitting the old wisdom via a set of texts called the Five Classics. During his return, Confucius sometimes acted as an advisor to several government officials in Lu, including Ji Kengzi, on matters including governance and crime. Burdened by the loss of both his son and his favorite disciples, he died at the age of 71 or 72 from natural causes. Confucius was buried in Konglin Cemetery, which lies in the historical part of Khufu in the Shandong province. The original tomb erected there in memory of Confucius on the bank of the Sishui River had the shape of an axe. In addition, it has a raised brick platform at the front of the memorial for offerings such as sandalwood, incense, and fruit. His philosophical teachings, called Confucianism, emphasized personal and governmental morality, correctness of social relationships, justice, kindness, and sincerity. Confucianism was part of the Chinese social fabric and way of life. To Confucians, everyday life was the arena of religion. His followers competed successfully with many other schools during the Hundred Schools of Thought era, only to be suppressed in favor of the legalists during the Qin dynasty. Following the victory of Hao over Chu after the collapse of Qin, Confucius's thoughts received official sanction in the new government. During the Tang and Song dynasties, Confucianism developed into a system known in the West as Neo-Confucianism, and later as New Confucianism. Confucius is traditionally credited with having authored or edited many of the Chinese classic texts, including all of the 5 classics, but modern scholars are cautious of attributing specific assertions to Confucius himself. Aphorisms concerning his teachings were compiled in the Analects, but only many years after his death. Confucius's principles have commonality with Chinese tradition and belief. With filial piety, he championed strong family loyalty, ancestor veneration, and respect of elders by their children and of husbands by their wives, recommending family as a basis for ideal government. He espoused the well-known principle, do not do unto others what you do not want done to yourself, the golden rule. Although Confucianism is often followed in a religious manner by the Chinese, many argue that its values are secular and that it is, therefore, less a religion than a secular morality. Proponents argue, however, that despite the secular nature of Confucianism's teachings, it is based on a worldview that is religious. Confucianism discusses elements of the afterlife and views concerning heaven, but it is relatively unconcerned with some spiritual matters often considered essential to religious thought, such as the nature of souls. In the Analects, Confucius presents himself as a transmitter who invented nothing. He puts the greatest emphasis on the importance of study, and it is the Chinese character for study that opens the text. Far from trying to build a systematic or formalist theory, he wanted his disciples to master and internalize older classics, so that their deep thought and thorough study would allow them to relate the moral problems of the present to past political events, as recorded in the annals, or the past expressions of commoners' feelings and noblemen's reflections, as in the poems of the Book of Odes. Ethics. One of the deepest teachings of Confucius may have been the superiority of personal exemplification over explicit rules of behavior. His moral teachings emphasized self-cultivation, emulation of moral exemplars, and the attainment of skilled judgment rather than knowledge of rules. Confucian ethics may, therefore, be considered a type of virtue ethics. His teachings rarely rely on reasoned argument, and ethical ideals and methods are conveyed indirectly, through allusion, innuendo, and even tautology. His teachings require examination and context to be understood. A good example is found in this famous anecdote. Zhu Fenzi Tui Chao, Yu, Shang Ren Hu, Bu Wen Ma. When the stables were burnt down, on returning from court Confucius said, was anyone hurt? He did not ask about the horses. Analects by 0.11 tr. Vale 10 to 13 tr. Leg or X 17 tr. Lao. By not asking about the horses, Confucius demonstrates that the sage values human beings over property. Readers are led to reflect on whether their response would follow Confucius's and to pursue self-improvement if it would not have. Confucius serves not as an all-powerful deity or a universally true set of abstract principles, but rather the ultimate model for others. For these reasons, according to many commentators, Confucius's teachings may be considered a Chinese example of humanism. Notice the implication that animal lives are part of property. Often overlooked in Confucian ethics are the virtues to the self, sincerity and the cultivation of knowledge. Virtuous action towards others begins with virtuous and sincere thought, which begins with knowledge. A virtuous disposition without knowledge is susceptible to corruption, and virtuous action without sincerity is not true righteousness. Cultivating knowledge and sincerity is also important for one's own sake, the superior person loves learning for the sake of learning and righteousness for the sake of righteousness. The Confucian theory of ethics as exemplified in Li is based on three important conceptual aspects of life. A. Ceremonies associated with sacrifice to ancestors and deities of various types. B. Social and political institutions. And C. The etiquette of daily behavior. Some believed that Li originated from the heavens, but Confucius stressed the development of Li through the actions of sage leaders in human history. His discussions of Li seem to redefine the term to refer to all actions committed by a person to build the ideal society, rather than those simply conforming with canonical standards of ceremony. In the early Confucian tradition, Li was doing the proper thing at the proper time, balancing between maintaining existing norms to perpetuate an ethical social fabric, and violating them in order to accomplish ethical good. Training in the Li of past sages cultivates virtues in people that include ethical judgment about when Li must be adapted in light of situational contexts. In Confucianism, the concept of Li is closely related to Yi, which is based upon the idea of reciprocity. Yi can be translated as righteousness, though it may simply mean what is ethically best to do in a certain context. The term contrasts with action done out of self-interest. While pursuing one's own self-interest is not necessarily bad, one would be a better, more righteous person if one's life was based upon following a path designed to enhance the greater good. Thus, an outcome of Yi is doing the right thing for the right reason. Just as action according to Li should be adapted to conform to the aspiration of adhering to Yi, so Yi is linked to the core value of Ren. Ren consists of 5 basic virtues: seriousness, generosity, sincerity, diligence, and kindness. Ren is the virtue of perfectly fulfilling one's responsibilities toward others, most often translated as benevolence, or humaneness. Translator Arthur Wale calls it goodness, with a capital G, and other translations that have been put forth include authoritativeness and selflessness. Confucius's moral system was based upon empathy and understanding others, rather than divinely ordained rules. To develop one's spontaneous responses of Ren so that these could guide action intuitively was even better than living by the rules of Yi. Confucius asserts that virtue is a mean between extremes. For example, the properly generous person gives the right amount, not too much and not too little. Politics. Confucius's political thought is based upon his ethical thought. He argued that the best government is one that rules through rights and people's natural morality, and not by using bribery and coercion. He explained that this is one of the most important analects. If the people be led by laws, and uniformity sought to be given them by punishments, they will try to avoid the punishment, but have no sense of shame. If they be led by virtue, and uniformity sought to be given them by the rules of propriety, they will have the sense of the shame, and moreover will become good. Translated by James Legge in The Great Learning. This sense of shame is an internalization of duty, where the punishment precedes the evil action, instead of following it in the form of laws as in legalism. Confucius looked nostalgically upon earlier days, and urged the Chinese, particularly those with political power, to model themselves on earlier examples. In times of division, chaos, and endless wars between feudal states, he wanted to restore the mandate of heaven Tianming, that could unify the world, Tianqia, all under heaven, and bestow peace and prosperity on the people. Because his vision of personal and social perfections was framed as a revival of the ordered society of earlier times, Confucius is often considered a great proponent of conservatism, but a closer look at what he proposes often shows that he used, and perhaps twisted, past institutions and rights to push a new political agenda of his own, a revival of a unified royal state, whose rulers would succeed to power on the basis of their moral merits instead of lineage. These would be rulers devoted to their people, striving for personal and social perfection, and such a ruler would spread his own virtues to the people instead of imposing proper behavior with laws and rules. In the era when the Great Tao was implemented, the world was in fear and everyone elected moral and capable people as their leaders. They emphasized credibility and got along with each other in harmony. Therefore, People not only regard their relatives as relatives but also all people, also not only their sons and daughters as children, so that the elderly can spend their twilight years in peace, the ability of all mature people can be exerted, the young people can grow up health. For people who are widows, loneliness, disability and sick can be taken care of by society. All men have professions, and women all marry at the right time to the right person. For property, people just don't want it to be thrown on the ground in vain, and it doesn't necessarily have to be hidden in their own homes. For work, people are afraid that the things are not done by themselves, but not only gain for themselves. Therefore, there is no market for intrigue matters, and the phenomenon of openly robbing and secretly injuring people has disappeared. Therefore, the door only needs to be brought on from the outside and does not need to be locked. This is called detong. Confucius's teachings were later turned into an elaborate set of rules and practices by his numerous disciples and followers, who organized his teachings into the Analects. Confucius's disciples and his only grandson, Zisi, continued his philosophical school after his death. These efforts spread Confucian ideals to students who then became officials in many of the royal courts in China, thereby giving Confucianism the first wide-scale test of its dogma. Two of Confucius's most famous later followers emphasized radically different aspects of his teachings. In the centuries after his death, Mencius Mengzi and Zunzi both compose important teachings elaborating in different ways on the fundamental ideas associated with Confucius. Mencius, 4th century BCE, articulated the innate goodness in human beings as a source of the ethical intuitions that guide people towards Ren, Yi, and Li, while Zunzi, 3rd century BCE, underscored the realistic and materialistic aspects of Confucian thought, stressing that morality was inculcated in society through tradition and in individuals through training. In time, their writings, together with the Analects and other core texts, came to constitute the philosophical corpus of Confucianism. This realignment in Confucian thought was parallel to the development of legalism, which saw filial piety as self-interest and not a useful tool for a ruler to create an effective state. The disagreement between these two political philosophies came to a head in 223 BCE when the Qin state conquered all of China. Li Si, Prime Minister of the Qin dynasty, convinced Qin Shi Huang to abandon the Confucians' recommendation of awarding fiefs akin to the Zhou dynasty before them, which he saw as being against to the legalist idea of centralizing the state around the ruler. When the Confucian advisors pressed their point, Li Si had many Confucian scholars killed and their books burned, considered a huge blow to the philosophy and Chinese scholarship. Under the succeeding Han and Tang dynasties, Confucian ideas gained even more widespread prominence. Under Wudi, the works of Confucius were made the official imperial philosophy and required reading for civil service examinations in 140 BCE, which was continued nearly unbroken until the end of the 19th century. As Mohism lost support by the time of the Han, the main philosophical contenders were legalism, which Confucian thought somewhat absorbed, the teachings of Lozi, whose focus on more spiritual ideas kept it from direct conflict with Confucianism, and the new Buddhist religion, which gained acceptance during the Southern and Northern dynasties era. Both Confucian ideas and Confucian-trained officials were relied upon in the Ming dynasty and even the Yuan dynasty, although Kublai Khan distrusted handing over provincial control to them. During the Song dynasty, the scholar Zhu Xi added ideas from Taoism and Buddhism into Confucianism. In his life, Zhu Xi was largely ignored, but not long after his death, his ideas became the new orthodox view of what Confucian texts actually meant. Modern historians view Zhu Xi as having created something rather different and call his way of thinking Neo-Confucianism. Neo-Confucianism held sway in China, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam until the 19th century. Confucius heavily promoted the use of music with rituals or the rites order. The scholar Li Zehao argued that Confucianism is based on the idea of rites. Rites serve as the starting point for each individual, and that these sacred social functions allow each person's human nature to be harmonious with reality. Given this, Confucius believed that music is the harmonization of heaven and earth, the rites as the order of heaven and earth. Thus, the application of music in rites creates the order that makes it possible for society to prosper. The Confucian approach to music was heavily inspired by the Shijing in the classic of music, which was said to be the sixth Confucian classic until it was lost during the Han dynasty. The Shijing serves as one of the current Confucian classics and is a book on poetry that contains a diversified variety of poems as well as folk songs. Confucius is traditionally ascribed with compiling these classics within his school. In the Analects, Confucius described the importance of the art in the development of society. The master said, "My children, why do you not study the book of poetry? The odes serve to stimulate the mind. They may be used for purposes of self-contemplation. They teach the art of sociability. They show how to regulate feelings of resentment. From them you learn the more immediate duty of serving one's father, and the remoter one of serving one's prince. From them we become largely acquainted with the names of birds, beasts, and plants." While he supported the idea of government ruling by a virtuous king, his ideas contained a number of elements to limit the power of rulers. He argued for representing truth in language, and honesty was of paramount importance. Even in facial expression, truth must always be represented. Confucius believed that if a ruler is to lead correctly, by action, that orders would be unnecessary and that others will follow the proper actions of their ruler. In discussing the relationship between a king and his subject, or a father and his son, he underlined the need to give due respect to superiors. This demanded that the subordinates must advise their superiors if the superiors are considered to be taking a course of action that is wrong. Confucius believed in ruling by example. If you lead correctly, orders by force or punishment are not necessary. Visual portraits. No contemporary painting or sculpture of Confucius survives, and it was only during the Han dynasty that he was portrayed visually. Carvings often depict his legendary meeting with Lozi. Since that time there have been many portraits of Confucius as the ideal philosopher. The oldest known portrait of Confucius has been unearthed in the tomb of the Han dynasty ruler Marquis of Hahung, died 59 BCE. The picture was painted on the wooden frame to a polished bronze mirror. In former times, it was customary to have a portrait in Confucius temples. However, during the reign of Hongwu Emperor Tezu, of the Ming dynasty, it was decided that the only proper portrait of Confucius should be in the temple in his hometown, Khufu in Shandong. In other temples, Confucius is represented by a memorial tablet. In 2006, the China Confucius Foundation commissioned a standard portrait of Confucius based on the Tang dynasty portrayed by Wu Dozi. The south wall frieze in the courtroom of the Supreme Court of the United States depicts Confucius as a teacher of harmony, learning, and virtue. Confucius began teaching after he turned 30, and taught more than 3,000 students in his life, about 70 of whom were considered outstanding. His disciples and the early Confucian community they formed became the most influential intellectual force in the Warring States period. The Han dynasty historian Sima Qian dedicated a chapter in his Records of the Grand Historian to the biographies of Confucius's disciples, accounting for the influence they exerted in their time and afterward. Sima Qian recorded the names of 77 disciples in his collective biography, while Kongzi Jiu, another early source, records 76, not completely overlapping. The two sources together yield the names of 96 disciples. 22 of them are mentioned in the Analects, while the Mencius records 24. Confucius did not charge any tuition, and only requested a symbolic gift of a bundle of dried meat from any prospective student. According to his disciple Zigong, his master treated students like doctors treated patients and did not turn anybody away. Most of them came from Lu, Confucius's home state, with 43 recorded, but he accepted students from all over China, with 6 from the state of Wei, such as Zigong, 3 from Qin, 2 each from Chen and Qi, and 1 each from Kai, Chu, and Song. Confucius considered his students' personal background irrelevant, and accepted noblemen, commoners, and even former criminals such as Yan Zhuoju and Gongye Chang. His disciples from richer families would pay a sum commensurate with their wealth, which was considered a ritual donation. Confucius's favorite disciple was Yan Hui, most probably one of the most impoverished of them all. Sima Niu, in contrast to Yan Hui, was from a hereditary noble family hailing from the Song state. Under Confucius's teachings, the disciples became well learned in the principles and methods of government. He often engaged in discussion and debate with his students and gave high importance to their studies in history, poetry, and ritual. Confucius advocated loyalty to principle rather than to individual acumen, in which reform was to be achieved by persuasion rather than violence. Even though Confucius denounced them for their practices, the aristocracy was likely attracted to the idea of having trustworthy officials who were studied in morals as the circumstances of the time made it desirable. In fact, the disciple Zilu even died defending his ruler in Wei. Yang Hu, who was a subordinate of the Ji family, had dominated the Lu government from 505 to 502 and even attempted a coup, which narrowly failed. As a likely consequence, it was after this that the first disciples of Confucius were appointed to government positions. A few of Confucius's disciples went on to attain official positions of some importance, some of which were arranged by Confucius. By the time Confucius was 50 years old, the Ji family had consolidated their power in the Lu state over the ruling ducal house. Even though the Ji family had practices with which Confucius disagreed and disapproved, they nonetheless gave Confucius's disciples many opportunities for employment. Confucius continued to remind his disciples to stay true to their principles and renounced those who did not, all the while being openly critical of the Ji family. The works of Confucius were first translated into European languages by Jesuit missionaries in the 16th century during the late Ming dynasty. The first known effort was by Michel Ruggieri, who returned to Italy in 1588 and carried on his translations while residing in Salerno. Matteo Ricci started to report on the thoughts of Confucius, and a team of Jesuits, Prospero Intosetta, Philippe Couplet, and two others published a translation of several Confucian works and an overview of Chinese history in Paris in 1687. François Noël, after failing to persuade Clement XI that Chinese veneration of ancestors and Confucius did not constitute idolatry, completed the Confucian canon at Prague in 1711, with more scholarly treatments of the other works and the first translation of the collected works of Mencius. It is thought that such works had considerable importance on European thinkers of the period, particularly among the deists and other philosophical groups of the Enlightenment who were interested by the integration of the system of morality of Confucius into Western civilization. In the modern era, Confucian movements, such as New Confucianism, still exist, but during the Cultural Revolution, Confucianism was frequently attacked by leading figures in the Chinese Communist Party. This was partially a continuation of the condemnations of Confucianism by intellectuals and activists in the early 20th century as a cause of the ethnocentric close-mindedness and refusal of the Qing dynasty to modernize that led to the tragedies that befell China in the 19th century. Confucius's works are studied by scholars in many other Asian countries, particularly those in the Chinese cultural sphere, such as Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. Many of those countries still hold the traditional memorial ceremony every year. Among Tibetans, Confucius is often worshipped as a holy king and master of magic, divination and astrology. Tibetan Buddhists see him as learning divination from the Buddha Manjushri, and that knowledge subsequently reaching Tibet through Princess Wencheng, while Bon practitioners see him as being a reincarnation of Tonpa Shenrab Mivoche, the legendary founder of Bon. The Amaya Muslim community believes Confucius was a divine prophet of God, as were Lao Tzu and other eminent Chinese personages. In modern times, asteroid 7853, Confucius, was named after the Chinese thinker. Because of the huge interest in the Confucius family tree, there was a project in China to test the DNA of known family members of the collateral branches in mainland China. Among other things, this would allow scientists to identify a common Y chromosome in male descendants of Confucius. If the descent were truly unbroken, father to son, since Confucius's lifetime, the males in the family would all have the same Y chromosome as their direct male ancestor, with slight mutations due to the passage of time. The aim of the genetic test was to help members of collateral branches in China who lost their genealogical records to prove their descent. However, in 2009, many of the collateral branches decided not to agree to DNA testing. Brian Sykes, professor of genetics at Oxford University, understands this decision. The Confucius family tree has an enormous cultural significance, he said. It's not just a scientific question. The DNA testing was originally proposed to add new members, many of whose family record books were lost during 20th century upheavals, to the Confucian family tree. The main branch of the family which fled to Taiwan was never involved in the proposed DNA test at all. In 2013, a DNA test performed on multiple different families who claimed descent from Confucius found that they shared the same Y chromosome as reported by Fudan University. The fifth and most recent edition of the Confucius genealogy was printed by the CGCC. It was unveiled in a ceremony at Khufu on September 24, 2009. Women are now included for the first time. Famous descendants include actors such as Gong Yu, real name Gong Jicheol Gongacheol, and Gong Hyo Jin, and artists such as male idol group B1A4 member Gong Chan, real name Gong Chan-sik, singer-songwriter Minzy, real name Gong Minji, as well as her great-aunt traditional folk dancer Gong Ok Jin. Despite repeated dynastic change in China, the title of Duke Yansheng was bestowed upon successive generations of descendants until it was abolished by the nationalist government in 1935. The last holder of the title, Kung Te Cheng of the 77th generation, was appointed sacrificial official to Confucius. Kung Te Cheng died in October 2008, and his son, Kung Wei Yi, the 78th lineal descendant, had died in 1989. Kung Te Cheng's grandson, Kung Sui Chang, the 79th lineal descendant, was born in 1975. His great-grandson, Kung Yu Zhen, the 80th lineal descendant, was born in Taipei on January 1, 2006. Te Cheng's sister, Kong Dimao, lives in mainland China and has written a book about her experiences growing up at the family estate in Khufu. Another sister, Kong Diki, died as a young woman. Many descendants of Confucius still live in Khufu today. A descendant of Confucius, H. Kung was the premier of the Republic of China. One of his sons, Kong Lingji, married Deborah Paget, who gave birth to Gregory Kung Kong the Ji. Confucius's family, the Kongs, have the longest recorded extant pedigree in the world today. The father-to-son family tree, now in its 83rd generation, has been recorded since the death of Confucius. According to the Confucius Genealogy Compilation Committee, CGCC, he has 2 million known and registered descendants, and there are an estimated 3 million in all. Of these, several tens of thousands live outside of China. In the 14th century, a Kong descendant went to Korea, where an estimated 34,000 descendants of Confucius live today. One of the main lineages fled from the Kong ancestral home in Khufu during the Chinese Civil War in the 1940s and eventually settled in Taiwan. There are also branches of the Kong family who have converted to Islam after marrying Muslim women, in Dachung in Gansu province in the 1800s, and in 1715 in Xuanwei in Yunnan province. Many of the Muslim Confucius descendants are descended from the marriage of Ma Jiaga, a Muslim woman, and Kong Yanrong, 59th generation descendant of Confucius in the year 1480, and are found among the Hui and Dongxiang peoples. The new genealogy includes the Muslims. Kong Dejun is a prominent Islamic scholar and Arabist from Ganghi province and a 77th generation descendant of Confucius. Soon after Confucius's death, Khufu, his hometown, became a place of devotion and remembrance. The Ha dynasty records of the Grand Historian records that it had already become a place of pilgrimage for ministers. It is still a major destination for cultural tourism, and many people visit his grave and the surrounding temples. In Sinic cultures, there are many temples where representations of the Buddha, Lozi, and Confucius are found together. There are also many temples dedicated to him, which have been used for Confucian ceremonies. Followers of Confucianism have a tradition of holding spectacular memorial ceremonies of Confucius every year, using ceremonies that supposedly derived from Zhou Li as recorded by Confucius, on the date of Confucius's birth. In the 20th century, this tradition was interrupted for several decades in mainland China, where the official stance of the Communist Party in the state was that Confucius and Confucianism represented reactionary feudalist beliefs which held that the subservience of the people to the aristocracy is a part of the natural order. All such ceremonies and rites were therefore banned. Only after the 1990s did the ceremony resume. As it is now considered a veneration of Chinese history and tradition, even Communist Party members may be found in attendance. In Taiwan, where the Nationalist Party Kuomintang strongly promoted Confucian beliefs in ethics and behavior, the tradition of the memorial ceremony of Confucius is supported by the government and has continued without interruption. While not a national holiday, it does appear on all printed calendars, much as Father's Day or Christmas Day do in the Western world. In South Korea, a grand-scale memorial ceremony called Seokjeon Daeje is held twice a year on Confucius's birthday and the anniversary of his death, at Confucian academies across the country and Sungkyunkwan in Seoul. Confucius's descendants were repeatedly identified and honored by successive imperial governments with titles of nobility and official posts. They were honored with the rank of a marquess 35 times since Gaozu of the Han dynasty, and they were promoted to the rank of duke 42 times from the Tang dynasty to the Qing dynasty. Emperor Xuanzong of Tang first bestowed the title of Duke Wenxuan on Kong Suji of the 35th generation. In 1055, Emperor Renzong of Song first bestowed the title of Duke Yansheng on Kong Zongung of the 46th generation. During the southern Song dynasty, the Duke Yansheng Kong Duanyu fled south with the Song Emperor to Kuzu in Zhejiang, while the newly established Jin dynasty 1115-1234 in the north appointed Kong Duanyu's brother Kong Duansao, who remained in Kufu as Duke Yansheng. From that time up until the Yuan dynasty, there were two Duke Yanshengs, one in the north in Kufu and the other in the south at Kuzu. An invitation to come back to Kufu was extended to the southern Duke Yansheng Kongzhu by the Yuan dynasty Emperor Kublai Khan. The title was taken away from the southern branch after Kongzhu rejected the invitation, so the northern branch of the family kept the title of Duke Yansheng. The southern branch remained in Kuzu, where they live to this day. Confucius's descendants in Kuzu alone number 30,000. The Hanline Academy rank of Wujing Boshi was awarded to the southern branch at Kuzu by a Ming emperor, while the northern branch at Kufu held the title Duke Yansheng. The leader of the southern branch is Kong Xiangkai Kong Zhangkai. In 1351, during the reign of Emperor Toghung Temur of the Yuan dynasty, 53rd generation descendant Konghun's second son Kong Xiao moved from China to Korea during the Goryeo dynasty, and was received courteously by Princess Noguk, the Mongolian-born wife of the future King Gongmin. After being naturalized as a Korean citizen, he changed the hanja of his name from to, both pronounced so in Korean 103, married a Korean woman and bore a son, therefore establishing the Chungwan Gong clan, whose ancestral seat was located in Chungwan, South Gyeongsang Province. The clan then received an aristocratic rank during the succeeding Joseon dynasty. In 1794, during the reign of King Zhengzhou, the clan then changed its name to Gokbu Gong clan in honor of Confucius's birthplace Kufu. In honor of Karl Heinrich Marx, the 5th of May 1818 to the 14th of March 1883, was a German philosopher, critic of political economy, historian, sociologist, political theorist, journalist and socialist revolutionary. Born in Trier, Germany, Marx studied law and philosophy at the universities of Bonn and Berlin. He married German theater critic and political activist Jenny von Westphalen in 1843. Due to his political publications, Marx became stateless and lived in exile with his wife and children in London for decades, where he continued to develop his thought in collaboration with German thinker Friedrich Engels and publish his writings, researching in the British Museum Reading Room. His best-known titles are the 1848 pamphlet The Communist Manifesto and the three-volume Das Kapital 1867-1883. Marx's political and philosophical thought had enormous influence on subsequent intellectual, economic and political history. His name has been used as an adjective, a noun, and a school of social theory. Marx's critical theories about society, economics, and politics, collectively understood as Marxism, hold that human societies develop through class conflict. In the capitalist mode of production, this manifests itself in the conflict between the ruling classes known as the bourgeoisie, that control the means of production, and the working classes known as the proletariat, that enable these means by selling their labor power in return for wages. Employing a critical approach known as historical materialism, Marx predicted that capitalism produced internal tensions like previous socio-economic systems and that those would lead to its self-destruction and replacement by a new system known as the socialist mode of production. For Marx, class antagonisms under capitalism, owing in part to its instability and crisis-prone nature, would eventuate the working class's development of class consciousness, leading to their conquest of political power and eventually the establishment of a classless, communist society constituted by a free association of producers. Marx actively pressed for its implementation, arguing that the working class should carry out organized proletarian revolutionary action to topple capitalism and bring about socio-economic emancipation. Marx has been described as one of the most influential figures in human history, and his work has been both lauded and criticized. His work in economics laid the basis for some current theories about labor and its relation to capital. Many intellectuals, labor unions, artists, and political parties worldwide have been influenced by Marx's work, with many modifying or adapting his ideas. Marx is typically cited as one of the principal architects of modern social science. Childhood and early education, 1818–1836. Karl Heinrich Marx was born on 5 May 1818 to Heinrich Marx 1777–1838, and Henriette Pressburg 1788–1863. He was born at Bruckengasse 664 in Trier, an ancient city then part of the Kingdom of Prussia's province of the Lower Rhine. Marx's family was originally non-religious Jewish, but had converted formally to Christianity before his birth. His maternal grandfather was a Dutch rabbi, while his paternal line had supplied Trier's rabbis since 1723, a role taken by his grandfather Meyer Halevi Marx. His father, as a child known as Herschel, was the first in the line to receive a secular education. He became a lawyer with a comfortably upper-middle-class income, and the family owned a number of Moselle vineyards, in addition to his income as an attorney. Prior to his son's birth and after the abrogation of Jewish emancipation in the Rhineland, Herschel converted from Judaism to join the State Evangelical Church of Prussia, taking on the German forename Heinrich over the Yiddish Herschel. By 1837, Marx was writing both fiction and non-fiction, having completed a short novel, Scorpion and Felix, a drama, Aulenem, as well as a number of love poems dedicated to Jenny von Westphalen. None of this early work was published during his lifetime. The love poems were published posthumously in the collected works of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, Volume 1. Marx soon abandoned fiction for other pursuits, including the study of both English and Italian, art history and the translation of Latin classics. He began cooperating with Bruno Bauer on editing Hegel's Philosophy of Religion in 1840. Marx was also engaged in writing his doctoral thesis, The Difference Between the Democritan and Epicurean Philosophy of Nature, which he completed in 1841. It was described as a daring and original piece of work in which Marx set out to show that theology must yield to the superior wisdom of philosophy. The essay was controversial, particularly among the conservative professors at the University of Berlin. Marx decided instead to submit his thesis to the more liberal University of Jena, whose faculty awarded him his PhD. In April 1841. As Marx and Bauer were both atheists, in March 1841 they began plans for a journal entitled Archive des Atheismes, Atheistic Archives, but it never came to fruition. In July, Marx and Bauer took a trip to Bonn from Berlin. There they scandalized their class by getting drunk, laughing in church and galloping through the streets on donkeys. Marx was considering an academic career, but this path was barred by the government's growing opposition to classical liberalism and the young Hegelians. Marx moved to Cologne in 1842, where he became a journalist, writing for the radical newspaper Rheinische Zeitung Rhineland News, expressing his early views on socialism and his developing interest in economics. Marx criticized right-wing European governments as well as figures in the liberal and socialist movements, whom he thought ineffective or counterproductive. The newspaper attracted the attention of the Prussian government censors, who checked every issue for seditious material before printing. As Marx lamented, "Our newspaper has to be presented to the police to be sniffed at, and if the police smells anything un-Christian or un-Prussian, the newspaper is not allowed to appear." After the Rheinische Zeitung published an article strongly criticizing the Russian monarchy, Tsar Nicholas I requested it be banned and Prussia's government complied in 1843. Paris, 1843-1845. In 1843, Marx became co-editor of a new, radical left-wing Parisian newspaper, the Deutsche Französische Jahrbuch, German-French Annals, then being set up by the German activist Arnold Ruge to bring together German and French radicals. Therefore Marx and his wife moved to Paris in October 1843. Initially living with Ruge and his wife communally at 23 Rue Vanneau, they found the living conditions difficult, so moved out following the birth of their daughter Jenny in 1844. Although intended to attract writers from both France and the German states, the Jahrbuch was dominated by the latter, and the only non-German writer was the exiled Russian anarchist collectivist Mikhail Bakunin. Marx contributed 2 essays to the paper, Introduction to a Contribution to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, and On the Jewish Question, the latter introducing his belief that the proletariat were a revolutionary force and marking his embrace of communism. Only one issue was published, but it was relatively successful, largely owing to the inclusion of Heinrich Heine's satirical odes on King Ludwig of Bavaria, leading the German states to ban it and seize imported copies. Ruge nevertheless refused to fund the publication of further issues, and his friendship with Marx broke down. After the paper's collapse, Marx began writing for the only uncensored German-language radical newspaper left, Vorwärts. Forward. Based in Paris, the paper was connected to the League of the Just, a utopian socialist secret society of workers and artisans. Marx attended some of their meetings but did not join. In Vorwärts, Marx refined his views on socialism based upon Hegelian and Feuerbachchian ideas of dialectical materialism, at the same time criticizing liberals and other socialists operating in Europe. On the 28th of August 1844, Marx met the German socialist Friedrich Engels at the Café de la Régence, beginning a lifelong friendship. Engels showed Marx his recently published The Condition of the Working Class in England in 1844, convincing Marx that the working class would be the agent and instrument of the final revolution in history. Soon, Marx and Engels were collaborating on a criticism of the philosophical ideas of Marx's former friend, Bruno Bauer. This work was published in 1845 as The Holy Family. Although critical of Bauer, Marx was increasingly influenced by the ideas of the young Hegelians Max Stirner and Ludwig Feuerbach, but eventually Marx and Engels abandoned Feuerbachchian materialism as well. During the time that he lived at 38 Rue Vanneau in Paris, from October 1843 until January 1845, Marx engaged in an intensive study of political economy. Adam Smith, David Ricardo, James Mill, etc., the French socialists, especially Claude Henry Street, Simon and Charles Fourier, and the history of France. The study of political economy is a study that Marx would pursue for the rest of his life and would result in his major economic work, the 3-volume series called Das Kapital. Marxism is based in large part on 3 influences: Hegel's dialectics, French utopian socialism, and English economics. Together with his earlier study of Hegel's dialectics, the studying that Marx did during this time in Paris meant that all major components of Marxism were in place by the autumn of 1844. Marx was constantly being pulled away from his study of political economy, not only by the usual daily demands of the time, but additionally by editing a radical newspaper and later by organizing and directing the efforts of a political party during years of potentially revolutionary popular uprisings of the citizenry. Still, Marx was always drawn back to his studies of the economy, where he sought to understand the inner workings of capitalism. An outline of Marxism had definitely formed in the mind of Karl Marx by late 1844. Indeed, many features of the Marxist view of the world's political economy had been worked out in great detail, but Marx needed to write down all of the details of his economic worldview to further clarify the new economic theory in his own mind. Accordingly, Marx wrote the economic and philosophical manuscripts. These manuscripts covered numerous topics, detailing Marx's concept of alienated labor. However, by the spring of 1845, his continued study of political economy, capital and capitalism had led Marx to the belief that the new political economic theory that he was espousing, scientific socialism, needed to be built on the base of a thoroughly developed materialistic view of the world. The economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844 had been written between April and August 1844, but soon Marx recognized that the manuscripts had been influenced by some inconsistent ideas of Ludwig Feuerbach. Accordingly, Marx recognized the need to break with Feuerbach's philosophy in favor of historical materialism. Thus, a year later, in April 1845, after moving from Paris to Brussels, Marx wrote his 11 Theses on Feuerbach. The Theses on Feuerbach are best known for Thesis 11, which states that philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways, the point is to change it. This work contains Marx's criticism of materialism for being contemplative, idealism for reducing practice to theory, and, overall, philosophy for putting abstract reality above the physical world. It thus introduced the first glimpse at Marx's historical materialism, an argument that the world is changed not by ideas but by actual, physical, material activity and practice. In 1845, after receiving a request from the Prussian king, the French government shut down Vorwärts, with the interior minister, François Guizot, expelling Marx from France. At this point, Marx moved from Paris to Brussels, where Marx hoped to once again continue his study of capitalism and political economy. Brussels, 1845-1848. Unable either to stay in France or to move to Germany, Marx decided to emigrate to Brussels in Belgium in February 1845. However, to stay in Belgium he had to pledge not to publish anything on the subject of contemporary politics. In Brussels, Marx associated with other exiled socialists from across Europe, including Moses Hess, Karl Heinz and Joseph Wedemeyer. In April 1845, Engels moved from Barmen in Germany to Brussels to join Marx and the growing cadre of members of the League of the Just now seeking home in Brussels. Later, Mary Burns, Engels' longtime companion, left Manchester, England to join Engels in Brussels. Largely non-religious, Heinrich was a man of the Enlightenment, interested in the ideas of the philosophers Immanuel Kant and Voltaire. A classical liberal, he took part in agitation for a constitution and reforms in Prussia, which was then an absolute monarchy. In 1815, Heinrich Marx began working as an attorney and in 1819 moved his family to a 10-room property near the Porta Nigra. His wife, Henriette Pressburg, was a Dutch Jewish woman from a prosperous business family that later founded the company Philips Electronics. Her sister Sophie Pressburg, 1797-1854, married Lion Philips, 1794-1866, and was the grandmother of both Gerard and Anton Philips and great-grandmother to Fritz Philips. Lion Philips was a wealthy Dutch tobacco manufacturer and industrialist, upon whom Karl and Jenny Marx would later often come to rely for loans while they were exiled in London. Little is known of Marx's childhood. The third of 9 children, he became the eldest son when his brother Moritz died in 1819. Marx and his surviving siblings, Sophie, Hermann, Henriette, Louise, Emily, and Caroline, were baptized into the Lutheran Church in August 1824, and their mother in November 1825. Marx was privately educated by his father until 1830 when he entered Trier High School, Gymnasium zu Trier, whose headmaster, Hugo Wittenberg, was a friend of his father. By employing many liberal humanists as teachers, Wittenberg incurred the anger of the local conservative government. Subsequently, police raided the school in 1832 and discovered that literature espousing political liberalism was being distributed among the students. Considering the distribution of such material a seditious act, the authorities instituted reforms and replaced several staff during Marx's attendance. In October 1835, at the age of 17, Marx traveled to the University of Bonn wishing to study philosophy and literature, but his father insisted on law as a more practical field. Due to a condition referred to as a weak chest, Marx was excused from military duty when he turned 18. While at the university at Bonn, Marx joined the Poets' Club, a group containing political radicals that were monitored by the police. Marx also joined the Trier Tavern Club drinking society, German, Landsmannschaft der Treveraner, where many ideas were discussed, and at one point he served as the club's co-president. Additionally, Marx was involved in certain disputes, some of which became serious. In August 1836 he took part in a duel with a member of the university's Borussian Corps. Although his grades in the first term were good, they soon deteriorated, leading his father to force a transfer to the more serious and academic University of Berlin. Hegelianism and Early Journalism, 1836-1843. Spending summer and autumn 1836 in Trier, Marx became more serious about his studies and his life. He became engaged to Jenny von Westphalen, an educated member of the petty nobility who had known Marx since childhood. As she had broken off her engagement with a young aristocrat to be with Marx, their relationship was socially controversial owing to the differences between their religious and class origins, but Marx befriended her father Ludwig von Westphalen, a liberal aristocrat, and later dedicated his doctoral thesis to him. 7 years after their engagement, on the 19th of June 1843, they married in a Protestant church in Kreuznach. In October 1836, Marx arrived in Berlin, matriculating in the university's Faculty of Law and renting a room in the Mittelstrasse. During the first term, Marx attended lectures of Edward Gunz, who represented the progressive Hegelian standpoint, elaborated on rational development in history by emphasizing particularly its libertarian aspects, and the importance of social question, and of Carl von Savigny, who represented the historical school of law. Although studying law, he was fascinated by philosophy and looked for a way to combine the two, believing that without philosophy nothing could be accomplished. Marx became interested in the recently deceased German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, whose ideas were then widely debated among European philosophical circles. During a convalescence in Strellau, he joined the Doctors' Club, Doctor Club, a student group which discussed Hegelian ideas, and through them became involved with a group of radical thinkers known as the Young Hegelians in 1837. They gathered around Ludwig Feuerbach and Bruno Bauer, with Marx developing a particularly close friendship with Adolf Rutenberg. Like Marx, the Young Hegelians were critical of Hegel's metaphysical assumptions, but adopted his dialectical method to criticize established society, politics and religion from a left-wing perspective. Marx's father died in May 1838, resulting in a diminished income for the family. Marx had been emotionally close to his father and treasured his memory after his death. The successful sales of a contribution to the critique of political economy stimulated Marx in the early 1860s to finish work on the 3 large volumes that would compose his major life's work, Das Kapital and the Theories of Surplus Value, which discussed and critiqued the theoreticians of political economy, particularly Adam Smith and David Ricardo. Theories of Surplus Value is often referred to as the 4th volume of Das Kapital and constitutes one of the first comprehensive treatises on the history of economic thought. In 1867, the first volume of Das Kapital was published, a work which analyzed the capitalist process of production. Here Marx elaborated his labor theory of value, which had been influenced by Thomas Hodgkin. Marx acknowledged Hodgkin's admirable work, labor defended against the claims of capital at more than one point in Das Kapital. Indeed, Marx quoted Hodgkin as recognizing the alienation of labor that occurred under modern capitalist production. No longer was there any natural reward of individual labor. Each laborer produces only some part of a whole, and each part having no value or utility of itself, there is nothing on which the laborer can seize, and say, "This is my product, this will I keep to myself." In this first volume of Das Kapital, Marx outlined his conception of surplus value in exploitation, which he argued would ultimately lead to a falling rate of profit and the collapse of industrial capitalism. Demand for a Russian-language edition of Das Kapital soon led to the printing of 3,000 copies of the book in the Russian language, which was published on the 27th of March 1872. By the autumn of 1871, the entire first edition of the German-language edition of Das Kapital had been sold out and a second edition was published. Volumes 2 and 3 of Das Kapital remained mere manuscripts upon which Marx continued to work for the rest of his life. Both volumes were published by Engels after Marx's death. Volume 2 of Das Kapital was prepared and published by Engels in July 1893 under the name Capital II, The Process of Circulation of Capital. Volume 3 of Das Kapital was published a year later in October 1894 under the name Capital III, The Process of Capitalist Production as a Whole. Theories of surplus value derived from the sprawling economic manuscripts of 1861-1863, a second draft for Das Kapital, the latter spanning volumes 30 to 34 of the collected works of Marx and Engels. Specifically, Theories of Surplus Value runs from the latter part of the collected works' 30th volume through the end of their 32nd volume. Meanwhile, the larger economic manuscripts of 1861-1863 run from the start of the collected works' 30th volume through the first half of their 34th volume. The latter half of the collected works' 34th volume consists of the surviving fragments of the economic manuscripts of 1863-1864, which represented a third draft for Das Kapital, and a large portion of which is included as an appendix to the Penguin edition of Das Kapital, Volume 1. A German-language abridged edition of Theories of Surplus Value was published in 1905 and in 1910. This abridged edition was translated into English and published in 1951 in London, but the complete unabridged edition of Theories of Surplus Value was published as the fourth volume of Das Kapital in 1963 and 1971 in Moscow. During the last decade of his life, Marx's health declined and he became incapable of the sustained effort that had characterized his previous work. He did manage to comment substantially on contemporary politics, particularly in Germany and Russia. His critique of the Gotha program opposed the tendency of his followers Wilhelm Liebknecht and August Bebel to compromise with the state socialism of Ferdinand Lassalle in the interests of a united socialist party. This work is also notable for another famous Marx quote, "From each according to his ability, to each according to his need." In a letter to Vera Zasulich dated the 8th of March 1881, Marx contemplated the possibility of Russia's bypassing the capitalist stage of development and building communism on the basis of the common ownership of land characteristic of the village mere. While admitting that Russia's rural commune is the fulcrum of social regeneration in Russia, Marx also warned that in order for the mere to operate as a means for moving straight to the socialist stage without a preceding capitalist stage, it would first be necessary to eliminate the deleterious influences which are assailing it, the rural commune, from all sides. Given the elimination of these pernicious influences, Marx allowed that normal conditions of spontaneous development of the rural commune could exist. However, in the same letter to Vera Zasulich he points out that, at the core of the capitalist system, lies the complete separation of the producer from the means of production. In one of the drafts of this letter, Marx reveals his growing passion for anthropology, motivated by his belief that future communism would be a return on a higher level to the communism of our prehistoric past. He wrote that, "The historical trend of our age is the fatal crisis which capitalist production has undergone in the European and American countries where it has reached its highest peak, a crisis that will end in its destruction, in the return of modern society to a higher form of the most archaic type, collective production and appropriation." He added that, "The vitality of primitive communities was incomparably greater than that of Semitic, Greek, Roman, etc. societies, and, a fortiori, that of modern capitalist societies. Before he died, Marx asked Engels to write up these ideas, which were published in 1884 under the title The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State. In mid-July 1845, Marx and Engels left Brussels for England to visit the leaders of the Chartists, a working-class movement in Britain. This was Marx's first trip to England and Engels was an ideal guide for the trip. Engels had already spent 2 years living in Manchester from November 1842 to August 1844. Not only did Engels already know the English language, he had also developed a close relationship with many Chartist leaders. Indeed, Engels was serving as a reporter for many Chartist and socialist English newspapers. Marx used the trip as an opportunity to examine the economic resources available for study in various libraries in London and Manchester. In collaboration with Engels, Marx also set about writing a book which is often seen as his best treatment of the concept of historical materialism, the German ideology. In this work, Marx broke with Ludwig Feuerbach, Bruno Bauer, Max Stirner and the rest of the young Hegelians, while he also broke with Karl Grun and other, true socialists, whose philosophies were still based in part on idealism. In German ideology, Marx and Engels finally completed their philosophy, which was based solely on materialism as the sole motive force in history. German ideology is written in a humorously satirical form, but even the satirical form did not save the work from censorship. Like so many other early writings of his, German ideology would not be published in Marx's lifetime and would be published only in 1932. After completing German ideology, Marx turned to a work that was intended to clarify his own position regarding the theory and tactics of a truly revolutionary proletarian movement, operating from the standpoint of a truly scientific materialist philosophy. This work was intended to draw a distinction between the utopian socialists and Marx's own scientific socialist philosophy. Whereas the utopians believed that people must be persuaded one person at a time to join the socialist movement. The way a person must be persuaded to adopt any different belief, Marx knew that people would tend, on most occasions, to act in accordance with their own economic interests, thus appealing to an entire class, the working class in this case, with a broad appeal to the class's best material interest would be the best way to mobilize the broad mass of that class to make a revolution and change society. This was the intent of the new book that Marx was planning, but to get the manuscript past the government censors he called the book The Poverty of Philosophy 1847, and offered it as a response to the petty bourgeois philosophy of the French anarchist socialist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon as expressed in his book The Philosophy of Poverty 1840. These books laid the foundation for Marx and Engels' most famous work, a political pamphlet that has since come to be commonly known as the Communist Manifesto. While residing in Brussels in 1846, Marx continued his association with the secret radical organization League of the Just. As noted above, Marx thought the League to be just the sort of radical organization that was needed to spur the working class of Europe toward the mass movement that would bring about a working class revolution. However, to organize the working class into a mass movement, the League had to cease its secret, or underground, orientation and operate in the open as a political party. Members of the League eventually became persuaded in this regard. Accordingly, in June 1847 the League was reorganized by its membership into a new open, above-ground, political society that appealed directly to the working classes. This new open political society was called the Communist League. Both Marx and Engels participated in drawing up the program and organizational principles of the new Communist League. In late 1847, Marx and Engels began writing what was to become their most famous work, a program of action for the Communist League. Written jointly by Marx and Engels from December 1847 to January 1848, the Communist Manifesto was first published on the 21st of February 1848. The Communist Manifesto laid out the beliefs of the new Communist League. No longer a secret society, the Communist League wanted to make aims and intentions clear to the general public rather than hiding its beliefs as the League of the Just had been doing. The opening lines of the pamphlet set forth the principal basis of Marxism: the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. It goes on to examine the antagonisms that Marx claimed were arising in the clashes of interest between the bourgeoisie, the wealthy capitalist class, and the proletariat, the industrial working class. Proceeding on from this, the manifesto presents the argument for why the Communist League, as opposed to other socialist and liberal political parties and groups at the time, was truly acting in the interests of the proletariat to overthrow capitalist society and to replace it with socialism. Later that year, Europe experienced a series of protests, rebellions, and often violent upheavals that became known as the revolutions of 1848. In France, a revolution led to the overthrow of the monarchy and the establishment of the French Second Republic. Marx was supportive of such activity, and having recently received a substantial inheritance from his father, withheld by his uncle Lionel Philips since his father's death in 1838, of either 6,000 or 5,000 francs, he allegedly used a third of it to arm Belgian workers who were planning revolutionary action. Although the veracity of these allegations is disputed, the Belgian Ministry of Justice accused Marx of it, subsequently arresting him, and he was forced to flee back to France, where with a new Republican government in power he believed that he would be safe. Cologne, 1848-1849. Temporarily settling down in Paris, Marx transferred the Communist League executive headquarters to the city and also set up a German workers' club with various German socialists living there. Hoping to see the revolution spread to Germany, in 1848 Marx moved back to Cologne, where he began issuing a handbill entitled The Demands of the Communist Party in Germany, in which he argued for only 4 of the 10 points of the Communist Manifesto, believing that in Germany at that time the bourgeoisie must overthrow the feudal monarchy and aristocracy before the proletariat could overthrow the bourgeoisie. On the 1st of June, Marx started the publication of a daily newspaper, the Rheinische Zeitung, which he helped to finance through his recent inheritance from his father. Designed to put forward news from across Europe with his own Marxist interpretation of events, the newspaper featured Marx as a primary writer and the dominant editorial influence. Despite contributions by fellow members of the Communist League, according to Friedrich Engels, it remained a simple dictatorship by Marx. Whilst editor of the paper, Marx and the other revolutionary socialists were regularly harassed by the police, and Marx was brought to trial on several occasions, facing various allegations including insulting the chief public prosecutor, committing a press misdemeanor, and inciting armed rebellion through tax boycotting, although each time he was acquitted. Meanwhile, the democratic parliament in Prussia collapsed, and the king, Frederick William IV, introduced a new cabinet of his reactionary supporters, who implemented counter-revolutionary measures to expunge left-wing and other revolutionary elements from the country. Consequently, the Rheinische Zeitung was soon suppressed and Marx was ordered to leave the country on the 16th of May. Marx returned to Paris, which was then under the grip of both a reactionary counter-revolution and a cholera epidemic, and was soon expelled by the city authorities, who considered him a political threat. With his wife Jenny expecting their 4th child and not able to move back to Germany or Belgium, in August 1849 he sought refuge in London. Moved to London and further writing, 1850-1860. Marx moved to London in early June 1849 and would remain based in the city for the rest of his life. The headquarters of the Communist League also moved to London. However, in the winter of 1849-1850, a split within the ranks of the Communist League occurred when a faction within it led by August Willich and Karl Schapper began agitating for an immediate uprising. Willich and Schapper believed that once the Communist League had initiated the uprising, the entire working class from across Europe would rise, spontaneously, to join it, thus creating revolution across Europe. Marx and Engels protested that such an unplanned uprising on the part of the Communist League was adventuristic, and would be suicide for the Communist League. Such an uprising as that recommended by the Schapper-Willich group would easily be crushed by the police and the armed forces of the reactionary governments of Europe. Marx maintained that this would spell doom for the Communist League itself, arguing that changes in society are not achieved overnight through the efforts and willpower of a handful of men. They are instead brought about through a scientific analysis of economic conditions of society and by moving toward revolution through different stages of social development. In the present stage of development, circa 1850, following the defeat of the uprisings across Europe in 1848, he felt that the Communist League should encourage the working class to unite with progressive elements of the rising bourgeoisie to defeat the feudal aristocracy on issues involving demands for governmental reforms, such as a constitutional republic with freely elected assemblies and universal, male suffrage. In other words, the working class must join with bourgeois and democratic forces to bring about the successful conclusion of the bourgeois revolution before stressing the working class agenda and a working class revolution. After a long struggle that threatened to ruin the Communist League, Marx's opinion prevailed and eventually, the Willich-Schapper group left the Communist League. Meanwhile, Marx also became heavily involved with the Socialist German Workers' Educational Society. The society held their meetings in Great Windmill Street, Soho, central London's entertainment district. This organization was also racked by an internal struggle between its members, some of whom followed Marx while others followed the Schapper-Willich faction. The issues in this internal split were the same issues raised in the internal split within the Communist League, but Marx lost the fight with the Schapper-Willich faction within the German Workers' Educational Society and on the 17th of September 1850 resigned from the society. New York Daily Tribune and journalism in the early period in London, Marx committed himself almost exclusively to his studies, such that his family endured extreme poverty. His main source of income was Engels, whose own source was his wealthy industrialist father. In Prussia as editor of his own newspaper, and contributed to others ideologically aligned, Marx could reach his audience, the working classes. In London, without finances to run a newspaper themselves, he and Engels turned to international journalism. At one stage they were being published by 6 newspapers from England, the United States, Prussia, Austria, and South Africa. Marx's principal earnings came from his work as European correspondent, from 1852 to 1862, for the New York Daily Tribune, and from also producing articles for more, bourgeois, newspapers. Marx had his articles translated from German by Wilhelm Pieper, until his proficiency in English had become adequate. The New York Daily Tribune had been founded in April 1841 by Horace Greeley. Its editorial board contained progressive bourgeois journalists and publishers, among them George Ripley and the journalist Charles Dana, who was editor-in-chief. Dana, a Fourierist and an abolitionist, was Marx's contact. The Tribune was a vehicle for Marx to reach a transatlantic public, such as for his hidden warfare against Henry Charles Carey. The journal had wide working class appeal from its foundation. At 2 cents, it was inexpensive, and, with about 50,000 copies per issue, its circulation was the widest in the United States. 14. Its editorial ethos was progressive and its anti-slavery stance reflected Greeley's. 82. Marx's first article for the paper, on the British parliamentary elections, was published on the 21st of August 1852. On the 21st of March 1857, Dana informed Marx that due to the economic recession only 1 article a week would be paid for, published or not, the others would be paid for only if published. Marx had sent his articles on Tuesdays and Fridays, but, that October, the Tribune discharged all its correspondents in Europe except Marx and B. Taylor, and reduced Marx to a weekly article. Between September and November 1860, only 5 were published. After a 6-month interval, Marx resumed contributions from September 1861 until March 1862, when Dana wrote to inform him that there was no longer space in the Tribune for reports from London, due to American domestic affairs. In 1868, Dana set up a rival newspaper, the New York Sun, at which he was editor-in-chief. In April 1857, Dana invited Marx to contribute articles, mainly on military history, to the New American Cyclopedia, an idea of George Ripley, Dana's friend and literary editor of the Tribune. In all, 67 Marx-Engels articles were published, of which 51 were written by Engels, although Marx did some research for them in the British Museum. By the late 1850s, American popular interest in European affairs waned and Marx's articles turned to topics such as the slavery crisis and the outbreak of the American Civil War in 1861 and the war between the states. Between December 1851 and March 1852, Marx worked on his theoretical work about the French Revolution of 1848, titled The 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon. In this he explored concepts in historical materialism, class struggle, dictatorship of the proletariat, and victory of the proletariat over the bourgeois state. The 1850s and 1860s may be said to mark a philosophical boundary distinguishing the young Marx's Hegelian idealism and the more mature Marx's scientific ideology associated with structural Marxism. However, not all scholars accept this distinction. For Marx and Engels, their experience of the revolutions of 1848 to 1849 were formative in the development of their theory of economics and historical progression. After the failures of 1848, the revolutionary impetus appeared spent and not to be renewed without an economic recession. Contention arose between Marx and his fellow communists, whom he denounced as adventurists. Marx deemed it fanciful to propose that willpower could be sufficient to create the revolutionary conditions when in reality the economic component was the necessary requisite. The recession in the United States' economy in 1852 gave Marx and Engels grounds for optimism for revolutionary activity, yet this economy was seen as too immature for a capitalist revolution. Open territories on America's western frontier dissipated the forces of social unrest. Moreover, any economic crisis arising in the United States would not lead to revolutionary contagion of the older economies of individual European nations, which were closed systems bounded by their national borders. When the so-called Panic of 1857 in the United States spread globally, it broke all economic theory models, and was the first truly global economic crisis. Financial necessity had forced Marx to abandon economic studies in 1844 and give 13 years to working on other projects. He had always sought to return to economics. First International and Das Kapital. Marx continued to write articles for the New York Daily Tribune as long as he was sure that the Tribune's editorial policy was still progressive. However, the departure of Charles Dana from the paper in late 1861 and the resultant change in the editorial board brought about a new editorial policy. No longer was the Tribune to be a strong abolitionist paper dedicated to a complete Union victory. The new editorial board supported an immediate peace between the Union and the Confederacy in the Civil War in the United States, with slavery left intact in the Confederacy. Marx strongly disagreed with this new political position and in 1863 was forced to withdraw as a writer for the Tribune. In 1864, Marx became involved in the International Workingmen's Association, also known as the First International, to whose General Council he was elected at its inception in 1864. In that organization, Marx was involved in the struggle against the anarchist wing centered on Mikhail Bakunin 1814-1876. Although Marx won this contest, the transfer of the seat of the General Council from London to New York in 1872, which Marx supported, led to the decline of the International. The most important political event during the existence of the International was the Paris Commune of 1871, when the citizens of Paris rebelled against their government and held the city for 2 months. In response to the bloody suppression of this rebellion, Marx wrote one of his most famous pamphlets, The Civil War in France, a defense of the Commune. Given the repeated failures and frustrations of workers' revolutions and movements, Marx also sought to understand and provide a critique suitable for the capitalist mode of production, and hence spent a great deal of time in the reading room of the British Museum studying. By 1857, Marx had accumulated over 800 pages of notes and short essays on capital, landed property, wage labor, the state, and foreign trade, and the world market, though this work did not appear in print until 1939, under the title Outlines of the Critique of Political Economy. In 1859, Marx published a contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, his first serious critique of political economy. This work was intended merely as a preview of his 3-volume Das Kapital English title, Capital, Critique of Political Economy, which he intended to publish at a later date. In a contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, Marx expands on the labor theory of value advocated by David Ricardo. The work was enthusiastically received, and the edition sold out quickly. Marx and von Westphalen had 7 children together, but partly owing to the poor conditions in which they lived whilst in London, only 3 survived to adulthood. The children were Jenny Caroline M. Longuet, 1844-1883. Jenny Laura M. Lafargue, 1845-1911. Edgar, 1847-1855. Henry Edward Guy, Guido, 1849-1850. Jenny Eveline Frances, Franziska, 1851-1852. Jenny Julia Eleanor, 1855-1898, and one more who died before being named, July 1857. According to his son-in-law, Paul Lafargue, Marx was a loving father. In 1962, there were allegations that Marx fathered a son, Freddie, out of wedlock by his housekeeper, Ellen Demuth, but the claim is disputed for lack of documented evidence. Marx frequently used pseudonyms, often when renting a house or flat, apparently to make it harder for the authorities to track him down. While in Paris, he used that of Monsieur Rimbaud, whilst in London, he signed off his letters as A. Williams. His friends referred to him as Moore, owing to his dark complexion and black curly hair, while he encouraged his children to call him Old Nick and Charlie. He also bestowed nicknames and pseudonyms on his friends and family as well, referring to Friedrich Engels as General, his housekeeper Ellen as Lenchen, or NYM, while one of his daughters, Jennychen, was referred to as Kiki, Emperor of China, and another, Laura, was known as Kakado, or the Hottentot. Death. Following the death of his wife Jenny in December 1881, Marx developed a catarrh that kept him in ill health for the last 15 months of his life. It eventually brought on the bronchitis and pleurisy that killed him in London on the 14th of March 1883, when he died a stateless person at age 64. Family and friends in London buried his body in Highgate Cemetery, East London, on the 17th of March 1883 in an area reserved for agnostics and atheists. George Eliot's grave is nearby. According to Francis Wien, there were between 9 and 11 mourners at his funeral. However, research from contemporary sources identifies 13 named individuals attending the funeral. They were Friedrich Engels, Eleanor Marx, Edward Aveling, Paul Lafargue, Charles Longuet, Ellen Demuth, Wilhelm Liebknecht, Gottlieb Lemke, Frederick Lessner, G. Lochner, Sir Ray Lancaster, Carl Schollemer, and Ernest Radford. A contemporary newspaper account claims that 25 to 30 relatives and friends attended the funeral. A writer in the Graphic noted that, by a strange blunder, his death was not announced for 2 days, and then as having taken place at Paris. The next day the correction came from Paris, and when his friends and followers hastened to his house in Haverstock Hill, to learn the time and place of burial, they learned that he was already in the cold ground. But for the sick and haste, a great popular demonstration would undoubtedly have been held over his grave. Several of his closest friends spoke at his funeral, including Wilhelm Liebknecht and Friedrich Engels. Engels' speech included the passage, on the 14th of March, at 2:45 in the afternoon, the greatest living thinker ceased to think. He had been left alone for scarcely 2 minutes, and when we came back we found him in his armchair, peacefully gone to sleep, but forever. Marx's surviving daughters Eleanor and Laura, as well as Charles Longuet and Paul Lafargue, Marx's 2 French socialist sons-in-law, were also in attendance. He had been predeceased by his wife and his eldest daughter, the latter dying a few months earlier in January 1883. Liebknecht, a founder and leader of the German Social Democratic Party, gave a speech in German, and Longuet, a prominent figure in the French working class movement, made a short statement in French. 2 telegrams from workers' parties in France and Spain were also read out. Together with Engels's speech, this constituted the entire program of the funeral. Non-relatives attending the funeral included 3 communist associates of Marx: Friedrich Lessner, imprisoned for 3 years after the Cologne Communist trial of 1852. G. Lochner, whom Engels described as an old member of the Communist League, and Karl Scholemer, a professor of chemistry in Manchester, a member of the Royal Society and a communist activist involved in the 1848 Baden Revolution. Another attendee of the funeral was Ray Lancaster, a British zoologist who would later become a prominent academic. Marx left a personal estate valued for probate at £250, equivalent to £25,365 in 2019. Upon his own death in 1895, Engels left Marx's two surviving daughters a significant portion of his considerable estate, valued in 2011 at $4.8 million United States dollars. Marx and his family were reburied on a new site nearby in November 1954. The tomb at the new site, unveiled on the 14th of March 1956, bears the carved message, "Workers of all lands unite," the final line of the Communist Manifesto. And, from the 11th thesis on Feuerbach, as edited by Engels, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways, the point however is to change it. The Communist Party of Great Britain, CPGB, had the monument with a portrait bust by Lawrence Bradshaw erected, and Marx's original tomb had only humble adornment. Black civil rights leader and CPGB activist Claudia Jones was later buried beside Karl Marx's tomb. The Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm remarked, "One cannot say Marx died a failure, because although he had not achieved a large following of disciples in Britain, his writings had already begun to make an impact on the left-wing movements in Germany and Russia." Within 25 years of his death, the continental European socialist parties that acknowledged Marx's influence on their politics were each gaining between 15 and 47% in those countries with representative democratic elections. Marx's ideas have had a profound impact on world politics and intellectual thought. Followers of Marx have often debated among themselves over how to interpret Marx's writings and apply his concepts to the modern world. The legacy of Marx's thought has become contested between numerous tendencies, each of which sees itself as Marx's most accurate interpreter. In the political realm, these tendencies include political theories such as Leninism, Marxism-Leninism, Trotskyism, Maoism, Luxemburgism, and libertarian Marxism. Various currents have also developed in academic Marxism, often under influence of other views, resulting in structuralist Marxism, historical Marxism, phenomenological Marxism, analytical Marxism, and Hegelian Marxism. From an academic perspective, Marx's work contributed to the birth of modern sociology. He has been cited as one of the 19th century's three masters of the school of suspicion, alongside Friedrich Nietzsche and Sigmund Freud, and as one of the three principal architects of modern social science along with Emil Durkheim and Max Weber. In contrast to other philosophers, Marx offered theories that could often be tested with the scientific method. Both Marx and Auguste Comte set out to develop scientifically justified ideologies in the wake of European secularization and new developments in the philosophies of history and science. Working in the Hegelian tradition, Marx rejected Comtean sociological positivism in an attempt to develop a science of society. Karl Loeth considered Marx and Soren Kierkegaard to be the two greatest Hegelian philosophical successors. In modern sociological theory, Marxist sociology is recognized as one of the main classical perspectives. Isaiah Berlin considers Marx the true founder of modern sociology, insofar as anyone can claim the title. Beyond social science, he has also had a lasting legacy in philosophy, literature, the arts, and the humanities. Social theorists of the 20th and 21st centuries have pursued two main strategies in response to Marx. One move has been to reduce it to its analytical core, known as analytical Marxism. Another, more common move has been to dilute the explanatory claims of Marx's social theory and emphasize the relative autonomy of aspects of social and economic life not directly related to Marx's central narrative of interaction between the development of the forces of production and the succession of modes of production. This has been the neo-Marxist theorizing adopted by historians inspired by Marx's social theory such as E. P. Thompson and Eric Hobsbawm. It has also been a line of thinking pursued by thinkers and activists such as Antonio Gramsci who have sought to understand the opportunities and the difficulties of transformative political practice, seen in the light of Marxist social theory. Marx's ideas would also have a profound influence on subsequent artists and art history, with avant-garde movements across literature, visual art, music, film, and theater. Politically, Marx's legacy is more complex. Throughout the 20th century, revolutions in dozens of countries labeled themselves Marxist, most notably the Russian Revolution, which led to the founding of the Soviet Union. Major world leaders including Vladimir Lenin, Mao Zedong, Fidel Castro, Salvador Allende, Josip Broz Tito, Kwame Nkrumah, Jawaharlal Nehru, Nelson Mandela, Xi Jinping, Jean-Claude and Thomas Sankara have all cited Marx as an influence. Beyond where Marxist revolutions took place, Marx's ideas have informed political parties worldwide. In countries associated with some Marxist claims, some events have led political opponents to blame Marx for millions of deaths, but the fidelity of these varied revolutionaries, leaders and parties to Marx's work is highly contested and has been rejected, including by many Marxists. It is now common to distinguish between the legacy and influence of Marx specifically and the legacy and influence of those who have shaped his ideas for political purposes. Andrew Lippau describes Marx and his collaborator Friedrich Engels as the founders of modern revolutionary democratic socialism. Marx remains both relevant and controversial. In May 2018, to mark the bicentenary of his birth, a 4.5-meter statue of him by leading Chinese sculptor Wu Weishan and donated by the Chinese government was unveiled in his birthplace of Trier. European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker defended Marx's memory, saying that today Marx stands for things which he is not responsible for and which he didn't cause because many of the things he wrote down were redrafted into the opposite. In 2017, a feature film, titled The Young Karl Marx, featuring Marx, his wife Jenny Marx and Engels, among other revolutionaries and intellectuals prior to the revolutions of 1848, received good reviews for both its historical accuracy and its brio in dealing with intellectual life. Another fictional representation to coincide with the bicentenary was Jason Barker's novel Marx Returns, which, despite being curious, funny, perplexing, and irreverent, nevertheless, according to philosopher Ray Brassier, casts unexpected light on Marx's thought. During his reign, his generals greatly expanded the size of the Chinese state. Campaigns south of Chu permanently added the Yu lands of Hunan and Guangdong to the Chinese cultural orbit. Campaigns in Central Asia conquered the Ordos Loop from the nomad Xiongnu, although eventually it would also lead to their confederation under Modu Chinyu. Qin Shi Huang also worked with his minister Li Si to enact major economic and political reforms aimed at the standardization of the diverse practices of the earlier Chinese states. He is traditionally said to have banned and burned many books and executed scholars. His public works projects included the unification of diverse state walls into a single Great Wall of China and a massive new national road system, as well as the city-sized mausoleum guarded by the life-sized terracotta army. He ruled until his death in 210 BC during his fourth tour of eastern China. Modern Chinese sources often give the personal name of Qin Shi Huang as Ying Zheng, with Ying taken as the surname and Zheng the given name. In ancient China, however, the naming convention differed, and Zhao, the place where he was born and raised, may be used as the surname. Unlike modern Chinese names, the nobles of ancient China had two distinct surnames. The ancestral name Xing comprised a larger group descended from a prominent ancestor, usually said to have lived during the time of the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors of Chinese legend, and the clan name Shi comprised a smaller group that showed a branch's current fief or recent title. The ancient practice was to list men's names separately. Sima Qian's Basic Annals of the First Emperor of Qin introduces him as given the name Zheng and the surname Zhao, or to combine the clan surname with the personal name. Sima's account of Chu describes the 16th year of the reign of King Kali as the time when Zhao Zheng was enthroned as king of Qin. However, since modern Chinese surnames, despite usually descending from clan names, use the same character as the old ancestral names, it is much more common in modern Chinese sources to see the emperor's personal name written as Ying Zheng, using the ancestral name of the Ying family. The rulers of Qin had styled themselves kings from the time of King Huan in 325 BC. Upon his ascension, Zheng became known as the King of Qin or King Zheng of Qin. This title made him the nominal equal of the rulers of Shank and of Zhou, the last of whose kings had been deposed by King Zhaoxiang of Qin in 256 BC. Following the surrender of Qi in 221 BC, King Zheng had reunited all of the lands of the former kingdom of Zhou. Rather than maintain his rank as king, however, he created a new title of Wandi Emperor for himself. This new title combined two titles, Huang of the mythical three sovereigns, San Huang, and the Di of the legendary five emperors, Wu Di of Chinese prehistory. The title was intended to appropriate some of the prestige of the Yellow Emperor, whose cult was popular in the later Warring States period and who was considered to be a founder of the Chinese people. King Zheng chose the new regnal name of first emperor, Shi Huangdi, formally transcribed as Shi Huangti. On the understanding that his successors would be successively titled the second emperor, third emperor, and so on through the generations. In fact, the scheme lasted only as long as his immediate heir, the second emperor. The new title carried religious overtones. For that reason, sinologists, starting with Peter Budberg or Edward Schaeffer, sometimes translate it as Theach, and the first emperor as the first Theach. As early as Sima Qian, it was common to shorten the resulting four-character Qin Shi Huangdi to Qin Shi Huang, variously transcribed as Qin Shi Huang or Qin Shi Huang. Following his elevation as emperor, both Zheng's personal name Zheng and possibly its homophone Zheng became taboo. The first emperor also arrogated the first-person Chinese pronoun Zhen **lum. Zhen, for his exclusive use, and in 212 BC began calling himself the Immortal. Others were to address him as Your Majesty, Baichia, Mod. Bixia, lit. Beneath the palace steps, in person, and Your Highness, Shank, in writing. According to the records of the Grand Historian, written by Sima Qian during the Ha dynasty, the first emperor was the eldest son of the Qin prince Yiren, who later became King Zhuangxiang of Qin. Prince Yiren at that time was residing at the court of Zhao, serving as a hostage to guarantee the armistice between the Qin and Zhao states. Prince Yiren had fallen in love at first sight with a concubine of Lu Buwei, a rich merchant from the state of Wei. Lu consented for her to be Yiren's wife, who then became known as Lady Zhao Zhaoji after the state of Zhao. He was given the name Zhao Zheng. The name Zheng came from his month of birth Zhengu, the first month of the Chinese lunar calendar. The clan name of Zhao came from his father's lineage and was unrelated to either his mother's name or the location of his birth. Song Zhong says that his birthday, significantly, was on the first day of Zhenggu. Liu Buwei's machinations later helped Yiren become King Zhuangxiang of Qin in 250 BC. However, the records of the grand historian also claimed that the first emperor was not the actual son of Prince Yiren but that of Liu Buwei. According to this account, when Liu Buwei introduced the dancing girl to the prince, she was Liu Buwei's concubine and had already become pregnant by him, and the baby was born after an unusually long period of pregnancy. According to translations of the Annals of Liu Buwei, Zhao Ji gave birth to the future emperor in the city of Handan in 259 BC, the first month of the 48th year of King Zhaoxiang of Qin. The idea that the emperor was an illegitimate child, widely believed throughout Chinese history, contributed to the generally negative view of the first emperor. However, a number of modern scholars have doubted this account of his birth. Sinologist Doug Bod wrote, "There is good reason for believing that the sentence describing this unusual pregnancy is an interpolation added to the Shiqi by an unknown person in order to slander the first emperor and indicate his political as well as natal illegitimacy." John Knobloch and Jeffrey Riegel, in their translation of Liu Buwei's Spring and Autumn Annals, call the story patently false, meant both to libel Liu and to cast aspersions on the first emperor. Claiming Liu Buwei, a merchant, as the first emperor's biological father was meant to be especially disparaging, since later Confucian society regarded merchants as the lowest of all social classes. In 246 BC, when King Zhuangxiang died after a short reign of just 3 years, he was succeeded on the throne by his 13-year-old son. At the time, Zhao Zheng was still young, so Liu Buwei acted as the regent prime minister of the state of Qin, which was still waging war against the other 6 states. 9 years later, in 235 BC, Zhao Zheng assumed full power after Liu Buwei was banished for his involvement in a scandal with Queen Dowager Zhao. Zhao Chengzhou, the Lord Chang'an Zhang in June, was Zhao Zheng's legitimate half-brother, by the same father but from a different mother. After Zhao Zheng inherited the throne, Chengzhou rebelled at Tinliu and surrendered to the state of Zhao. Chengzhou's remaining retainers and families were executed by Zhao Zheng. Lawai's attempted coup as King Zheng grew older. Liu Buwei became fearful that the boy king would discover his liaison with his mother Lady Zhao. He decided to distance himself and look for a replacement for the Queen Dowager. He found a man named Lao Ai. According to the record of Grand Historian, Lao Ai was disguised as a eunuch by plucking his beard. Later Lao Ai and Queen Zhao Ji got along so well they secretly had 2 sons together. Lao Ai then became ennobled as Marquis Lao Ai, and was showered with riches. Lao Ai's plot was supposed to replace King Zheng with one of the hidden sons. But during a dinner party drunken Lao Ai was heard bragging about being the young king's stepfather. In 238 BC the king was traveling to the former capital, Yong. Lao Ai seized the queen mother's seal and mobilized an army in an attempt to start a coup and rebel. When King Zheng discovered this fact, he ordered Liu Buwei to let Lord Changping and Lord Chengwen attack Lao Ai. Although the royal army killed hundreds of rebels at the capital, Lao Ai succeeded in fleeing from this battle. A price of 1 million copper coins was placed on Lao Ai's head if he was taken alive or 500,000 if dead. Lao Ai's supporters were captured and beheaded. Then Lao Ai was tied up and torn to 5 pieces by horse carriages, while his entire family was executed to the third degree. The two hidden sons were also killed, while Mother Zhao Ji was placed under house arrest until her death many years later. Liu Bouvet drank a cup of poison wine and committed suicide in 235 BC. Ying Zheng then assumed full power as the king of the Qin state. Replacing Liu Bouvet, Li Si became the new chancellor. King Zheng and his troops continued to take over different states. The state of Yan was small, weak and frequently harassed by soldiers. It was no match for the Qin state. So Crown Prince Dan of Yan plotted an assassination attempt to get rid of King Zheng, begging Jingke to go on the mission in 227 BC. Jingke was accompanied by Qin Guiyang in the plot. Each was supposed to present a gift to King Zheng, a map of Dukang and the severed head of Fan Wuji. Qin Guiyang first tried to present the map case gift, but trembled in fear and moved no further towards the king. Jingke continued to advance toward the king, while explaining that his partner has never set eyes on the Son of Heaven, which is why he is trembling. Jingke had to present both gifts by himself. While unrolling the map, a dagger was revealed. The king drew back, stood on his feet, but struggled to draw the sword to defend himself. At the time, other palace officials were not allowed to carry weapons. Jingke pursued the king, attempting to stab him, but missed. King Zheng drew out his sword and cut Jingke's thigh. Jingke then threw the dagger, but missed again. Suffering 8 wounds from the king's sword, Jingke realized his attempt had failed and knew that both of them would be killed afterwards. The Yan state was conquered by the Qin state 5 years later. Second attempted assassination. Gao Jianli was a close friend of Jingke, who wanted to avenge his death. As a famous lute player, one day he was summoned by King Zheng to play the instrument. Someone in the palace who had known him in the past exclaimed, "This is Gao Jianli." Unable to bring himself to kill such a skilled musician, the emperor ordered his eyes put out, but the king allowed Gao Jianli to play in his presence. He praised the playing and even allowed Gao Jianli to get closer. As part of the plot, the lute was fastened with a heavy piece of lead. He raised the lute and struck at the king. He missed, and his assassination attempt failed. Gao Jianli was later executed. In 230 BC, King Zheng unleashed the final campaigns of the Warring States period, setting out to conquer the remaining independent kingdoms, one by one. The first state to fall was Ha, sometimes called Han to distinguish it from the Ha of Ha dynasty, in 230 BC. Then Qin took advantage of natural disasters in 229 BC to invade and conquer Zhao, where Qin Shi Huang had been born. He now avenged his poor treatment as a child hostage there, seeking out and killing his enemies. Qin armies conquered the state of Zhao in 228 BC, the northern country of Yan in 226 BC, the small state of Wei in 225 BC, and the largest state and greatest challenge, Chu, in 223 BC. In 222 BC, the last remnants of Yan and the royal family were captured in Liaodong in the northeast. The only independent country left was now state of Qi, in the far east, what is now the Shandong Peninsula. Terrified, the young king of Qi sent 200,000 people to defend his western borders. In 221 BC, the Qin armies invaded from the north, captured the king, and annexed Qi. Some of the strategies Qin used to unify China were to standardize the trade and communication, currency and language. For the first time, all Chinese lands were unified under one powerful ruler. In that same year, King Zheng proclaimed himself the first emperor, Shi Huangdi, Shi Huangdi, no longer a king in the old sense and now far surpassing the achievements of the old Zhou dynasty rulers. The emperor ordered the Heishibi to be made into the imperial seal, known as the heirloom seal of the realm. The words, having received the mandate from heaven, make the emperor lead a long and prosperous life. Shou Ming Yu Tian, Ji Shou Yong Chang were written by Prime Minister Li Si, and carved onto the seal by Sun Shou. The seal was later passed from emperor to emperor for generations to come. In the south, military expansion in the form of campaigns against the Yu tribes continued during his reign, with various regions being annexed to what is now Guangdong province and part of today's Vietnam. In an attempt to avoid a recurrence of the political chaos of the Warring States period, Qin Shi Huang and his Prime Minister Li Si completely abolished feudalism. The empire was then divided into 36 commanderies, June, later more than 40 commanderies. The whole of China was thus divided into administrative units, first commanderies, then counties, Xian, townships, Xiang, and 100 family units, Li, which roughly corresponds to the modern-day subdistricts and communities. This system was different from the previous dynasties, which had loose alliances and federations. People could no longer be identified by their native region or former feudal state, as when a person from Chu was called Chu person, Chu Ren. Appointments were subsequently based on merit instead of hereditary rights. Economic reforms. Qin Shi Huang and Li Si unified China economically by standardizing the Chinese units of measurements such as weights and measures, the currency, and the length of the axles of carts to facilitate transport on the road system. The emperor also developed an extensive network of roads and canals connecting the provinces to improve trade between them. The currencies of the different states were also standardized to the Ban Liang coin, Ban Liang. Perhaps most importantly, the Chinese script was unified. Under Li Si, the seal script of the state of Qin was standardized through removal of variant forms within the Qin script itself. This newly standardized script was then made official throughout all the conquered regions, thus doing away with all the regional scripts to form one language, one communication system for all of China. While the previous Warring States era was one of constant warfare, it was also considered the golden age of free thought. Qin Shi Huang eliminated the 100 schools of thought which included Confucianism and other philosophies. After the unification of China, with all other schools of thought banned, legalism became the endorsed ideology of the Qin dynasty. Beginning in 213 BC, at the instigation of Li Si and to avoid scholars' comparisons of his reign with the past, Qin Shi Huang ordered most existing books to be burned with the exception of those on astrology, agriculture, medicine, divination, and the history of the state of Qin. This would also serve the purpose of furthering the ongoing reformation of the writing system by removing examples of obsolete scripts. Owning the Book of Songs or the classic of history was to be punished especially severely. According to the later records of the Grand Historian, The following year Qin Shi Huang had some 460 scholars buried alive for owning the forbidden books. The emperor's oldest son Fuzu criticized him for this act. Recent research suggests that the burying of the Confucian scholars alive is a Confucian martyr's legend. Rather, the emperor ordered the killing Keng of a group of alchemists after having found that they had fooled him. In hard times, the Confucian scholars, who had served the king loyally, used that incident to distance themselves from the failed dynasty. Kongangguo C. 165 c. 74 BC, a descendant of Confucius, turned the alchemists Fangxi into Confucianists Ruru, and entwined the martyr's legend with the strange story of the rediscovery of the lost Confucian books behind a demolished wall in the house of his ancestors. The emperor's own library still had copies of the forbidden books, but most of these were destroyed later when Xiang Yu burned the palaces of Shanyang in 206 BC. Qin Shi Huang also followed the theory of the five elements: earth, wood, metal, fire and water. Wu de Zhong Shi Shuo Zhao Zheng's birth element is water, which is connected with the color black. It was also believed that the royal house of the previous dynasty Zhou had ruled by the power of fire, which was the color red. The new Qin dynasty must be ruled by the next element on the list, which is water, represented by the color black. Black became the color for garments, flags, pennants. Other associations include north as the cardinal direction, winter season and the number 6. Tallies and official hats were 15 centimeters (5.9 inches) long, carriages 2 meters (6.6 feet) wide. One pace bu was 1.4 meters (4.6 feet). In 230 BC, the state of Qin had defeated the state of Ha. A Ha aristocrat named Zhang Liang swore revenge on the Qin emperor. He sold all his valuables and in 218 BC, he hired a strongman assassin and built him a heavy metal cone weighing 120 jin, roughly 160 pounds or 97 kilograms. The two men hid among the bushes along the emperor's route over a mountain. At a signal, the muscular assassin hurled the cone at the first carriage and shattered it. However, the emperor was actually in the second carriage, as he was traveling with two identical carriages for this very reason. Thus the attempt failed. Both men were able to escape in spite of a huge manhunt. Great Wall. The Qin fought nomadic tribes to the north and northwest. The Xiongnu tribes were not defeated and subdued, thus the campaign was tiring and unsuccessful, and to prevent the Xiongnu from encroaching on the northern frontier any longer, the emperor ordered the construction of an immense defensive wall. This wall, for whose construction hundreds of thousands of men were mobilized, and an unknown number died, is a precursor to the current Great Wall of China. It connected numerous state walls which had been built during the previous 4 centuries, a network of small walls linking river defenses to impassable cliffs. Intending to impose centralized rule and prevent the resurgence of feudal lords, Ying Zheng ordered the destruction of the sections of the walls that divided his empire among the former states. To position the empire against the Xiongnu people from the north, however, he ordered the building of new walls to connect the remaining fortifications along the empire's northern frontier. Build and move on was a central guiding principle in constructing the wall, implying that the Chinese were not erecting a permanently fixed border. Transporting the large quantity of materials required for construction was difficult, so builders always tried to use local resources. Stones from the mountains were used over mountain ranges, while rammed earth was used for construction in the plains. There are no surviving historical records indicating the exact length and course of the Keene walls. Most of the ancient walls have eroded away over the centuries, and very few sections remain today. The human cost of the construction is unknown, but it has been estimated by some authors that hundreds of thousands, if not up to 1 million, workers died building the Keene Wall. Lingkou Canal. A famous South China quotation was, "In the north there is the Great Wall, in the south there is the Lingkou Canal, Bu Zhang Cheng Nanyu Lingkou, Bu Chang Cheng, Nanyu Lingkou." In 214 BC, the emperor began the project of a major canal to transport supplies to the army. The canal allows water transport between North and South China. The canal, 34 kilometers in length, links the Xiang River, which flows into the Yangtze, and the Lijiang, which flows into the Pearl River. The canal connected two of China's major waterways and aided Kun's expansion into the southwest. The construction is considered one of the three great feats of ancient Chinese engineering, the others being the Great Wall and the Sichuan-Dujangyan irrigation system. Elixir of Life. Later in his life, Qin Shi Huang feared death and desperately sought the fabled Elixir of Life, which would supposedly allow him to live forever. He was obsessed with acquiring immortality and fell prey to many who offered him supposed elixirs. He visited Jifu Island 3 times in order to achieve immortality. In one case he sent Zhu Fu, a Jifu Islander, with ships carrying hundreds of young men and women in search of the mystical Penglai mountain. They were sent to find Anqi Sheng, a 1,000-year-old magician whom Qin Shi Huang had supposedly met in his travels and who had invited him to seek him there. These people never returned, perhaps because they knew that if they returned without the promised elixir, they would surely be executed. Legends claim that they reached Japan and colonized it. It is also possible that the book burning, a purge on what could be seen as wasteful and useless literature, was, in part, an attempt to focus the minds of the emperor's best scholars on the alchemical quest. Some of the executed scholars were those who had been unable to offer any evidence of their supernatural schemes. This may have been the ultimate means of testing their abilities. If any of them had magic powers, then they would surely come back to life when they were let out again. Since the emperor was afraid of death and evil spirits, he had workers build a series of tunnels and passageways to each of his over 200 palaces, because traveling unseen would supposedly keep him safe from the evil spirits. In 211 BC, a large meteor is said to have fallen in Dongjun in the lower reaches of the Yellow River. On it, an unknown person inscribed the words, "The first emperor will die and his land will be divided, Shi Huang Xia the Fen." When the emperor heard of this, he sent an imperial secretary to investigate this prophecy. No one would confess to the deed, so all the people living nearby were put to death. The stone was then pulverized. During his 5th tour of eastern China, the emperor became seriously ill after he arrived in Pingyunjin, Pingyun County, Shandong, and died on the 10th of September 210 BC Julian calendar, at the palace in Shakyu Prefecture Shakyu Pingtai, about 2 months away by road from the capital Shenyang. The cause of Qin Shi Huang's death is still largely unknown. Reportedly, he died from Chinese alchemical elixir poisoning due to ingesting mercury pills, made by his alchemists and court physicians, believing it to be an elixir of immortality. A possible contributing factor was illness due to the stress of running the empire. Second Emperor conspiracy. After the emperor's death, Prime Minister Li Si, who accompanied him, became extremely worried that the news of his death could trigger a general uprising in the empire. It would take 2 months for the entourage to reach the capital, and it would not be possible to stop the uprising. Li Si decided to hide the death of the emperor, and return to Shenyang. Most of the imperial entourage accompanying the emperor were left ignorant of the emperor's death. Only a younger son, Ying Huai, who was traveling with his father, the eunuch Zhao Gao, Li Si, and 5 or 6 favorite eunuchs knew of the death. Li Si also ordered that 2 carts containing rotten fish be carried immediately before and after the wagon of the emperor. The idea behind this was to prevent people from noticing the foul smell emanating from the wagon of the emperor, where his body was starting to decompose severely as it was summertime. They also pulled down the shade so no one could see his face, changed his clothes daily, brought food, and when he had to have important conversations, they would act as if he wanted to send them a message. Eventually, after about 2 months, Li Si and the imperial court reached Shenyang, where the news of the death of the emperor was announced. Qin Shi Huang did not like to talk about his own death and he had never written a will. After his death, the eldest son Fuzu would normally become the next emperor. Li Si and the chief eunuch Zhao Gao conspired to kill Fuzu because Fuzu's favorite general was Meng Tian, whom they disliked and feared. Meng Tian's brother, a senior minister, had once punished Zhao Gao. They believed that if Fuzu was enthroned, they would lose their power. Li Si and Zhao Gao forged a letter from Qin Shi Huang saying that both Fuzu and General Meng must commit suicide. The plan worked, and the younger son Hu He became the second emperor, later known as Qin Shi or second generation Qin. Qin Shi, however, was not as capable as his father. Revolts quickly erupted. His reign was a time of extreme civil unrest, and everything built by the first emperor crumbled away within a short period. One of the immediate revolt attempts was the 209 BC Days village uprising led by Chen Sheng and Wu Guang. The Chinese historian Sima Qian, writing a century after the first emperor's death, wrote that it took 700,000 men to construct the emperor's mausoleum. British historian John Mann points out that this figure is larger than the population of any city in the world at that time, and he calculates that the foundations could have been built by 16,000 men in 2 years. While Sima Qian never mentioned the Terracotta Army, the statues were discovered by a group of farmers digging wells on the 29th of March 1974. The soldiers were created with a series of mix and match clay molds and then further individualized by the artist's hand. Purple was also used on some of the warriors. There are around 6,000 terracotta warriors, and their purpose was to protect the emperor in the afterlife from evil spirits. Also among the army are chariots and 40,000 real bronze weapons. One of the first projects which the young king accomplished while he was alive was the construction of his own tomb. In 215 BC, Qin Shi Huang ordered General Meng Tian to begin its construction with the assistance of 300,000 men. Other sources suggest that he ordered 720,000 unpaid laborers to build his tomb according to his specifications. Again, given John Mann's observation regarding populations at the time, see paragraph above, these historical estimates are debatable. The main tomb containing the emperor has yet to be opened, and there is evidence suggesting that it remains relatively intact. Simakian's description of the tomb includes replicas of palaces and scenic towers, rare utensils and wonderful objects, 100 rivers made with mercury, representations of the heavenly bodies, and crossbows rigged to shoot anyone who tried to break in. The tomb was built at the foot of Mount Lee, 30 kilometers away from Zion. Modern archaeologists have located the tomb, and have inserted probes deep into it. The probes revealed abnormally high quantities of mercury, some 100 times the naturally occurring rate, suggesting that some parts of the legend are credible. Secrets were maintained, as most of the workmen who built the tomb were killed. Historiography. Traditional Chinese historiography almost always portrayed the first emperor of the Chinese Unified States as a brutal tyrant who had an obsessive fear of assassination. Ideological antipathy towards the legalist state of Qin was established as early as 266 BC, when Confucian philosopher Zunzi disparaged it. Later Confucian historians condemned the emperor who had burned the classics and had buried Confucian scholars alive. They eventually compiled a list of the 10 crimes of Keem to highlight his tyrannical actions. The famous Ha poet and statesman Jia Yi concluded his essay The Faults of King Guo King Lung, with what was to become the standard Confucian judgment of the reasons for Kan's collapse. Jia Yi's essay, admired as a masterpiece of rhetoric and reasoning, was copied into 2 great Ha histories and has had a far-reaching influence on Chinese political thought as a classic illustration of Confucian theory. He attributed Kan's disintegration to its internal failures. Jia Yi wrote that Qin, from a tiny base, had become a great power, ruling the land and receiving homage from all quarters for 100-odd years. Yet after they unified the land and secured themselves within the pass, a single common rustic could nevertheless challenge this empire. Why? Because the ruler lacked humaneness and rightness, because preserving power differs fundamentally from seizing power. In more modern times, historical assessment of the first emperor different from traditional Chinese historiography began to emerge. The reassessment was spurred on by the weakness of China in the latter half of the 19th century and early 20th century. At that time some began to regard Confucian traditions as an impediment to China's entry into the modern world, opening the way for changing perspectives. At a time when foreign nations encroached upon Chinese territory, leading Kuomintang historian Xiao Yushin emphasized the role of Qin Shi Huang in repulsing the northern barbarians, particularly in the construction of the Great Wall. Another historian, Ma Feibai, published in 1941 a full-length revisionist biography of the first emperor entitled Qin Shi Huangdi Jun, Qin Shi Huangdi Xuan, calling him one of the great heroes of Chinese history. Ma compared him with the contemporary leader Chiang Kai-shek and saw many parallels in the careers and policies of the two men, both of whom he admired. Chiang's northern expedition of the late 1920s, which directly preceded the new nationalist government at Nanjing, was compared to the unification brought about by Qin Shi Huang. With the coming of the Communist Revolution and the establishment of a new, revolutionary regime in 1949, another re-evaluation of the first emperor emerged as a Marxist critique. This new interpretation of Qin Shi Huang was generally a combination of traditional and modern views, but essentially critical. This is exemplified in the Complete History of China, which was compiled in September 1955 as an official survey of Chinese history. The work described the first emperor's major steps toward unification and standardization as corresponding to the interests of the ruling group in the merchant class, not of the nation or the people, and the subsequent fall of his dynasty is a manifestation of the class struggle. The perennial debate about the fall of the Qin dynasty was also explained in Marxist terms, the peasant rebellions being a revolt against oppression, a revolt which undermined the dynasty, but which was bound to fail because of a compromise with landlord class elements. Since 1972, however, a radically different official view of Qin Shi Huang in accordance with Maoist thought has been given prominence throughout China. Hong Shidi's biography Qin Shi Huang initiated the re-evaluation. The work was published by the state press as a mass popular history, and it sold 1.85 million copies within 2 years. In the new era, Qin Shi Huang was seen as a far-sighted ruler who destroyed the forces of division and established the first unified, centralized state in Chinese history by rejecting the past. Personal attributes, such as his quest for immortality, so emphasized in traditional historiography, were scarcely mentioned. The new evaluations described approvingly how, in his time, an era of great political and social change, he had no compunctions against using violent methods to crush counter-revolutionaries, such as the industrial and commercial slave owner, Chancellor Lu Buwei. However, he was criticized for not being as thorough as he should have been, and as a result, after his death, hidden subversives under the leadership of the chief eunuch Zhao Gao were able to seize power and use it to restore the old feudal order. To round out this re-evaluation, Luo Xiding put forward a new interpretation of the precipitous collapse of the Qin dynasty in an article entitled, On the Class Struggle During the Period Between Qin and Ha, in a 1974 issue of Red Flag, to replace the old explanation. The new theory claimed that the cause of the fall of Qin lay in the lack of thoroughness of Qin Shi Huang's dictatorship over the reactionaries, even to the extent of permitting them to worm their way into organs of political authority and usurp important posts. Mao Zedong was reviled for his persecution of intellectuals. On being compared to the first emperor, Mao boasted, he buried 460 scholars alive. We have buried 46,000 scholars alive. You intellectuals revile us for being Qin Shi Huangs. You are wrong. We have surpassed Qin Shi Huang 100-fold. When you berate us for imitating his despotism, we are happy to agree. Your mistake was that you did not say so enough. Tom Ambrose characterizes Qin Shi Huang as the founder of the first police state in history. As emperor, he initiated a series of reforms aimed at establishing a fully centralized administration, thus avoiding the rise of independent satrapies. Following the example of Qin and at the suggestion of Li Si, he abolished territorial feudal power in the empire, forced the wealthy aristocratic families to live in the capital, Shenyang, and divided the country into 36 military districts, each with its own military and civil administrator. He also issued orders for almost universal standardization, from weights, measures, and the axle lengths of carts to the written language and the laws. Construction of a network of roads and canals was begun, and fortresses erected for defense against barbarian invasions from the north were linked to form the Great Wall. In 220 Qin Shi Huang undertook the first of a series of imperial inspection tours that marked the remaining 10 years of his reign. While supervising the consolidation and organization of the empire, he did not neglect to perform sacrifices in various sacred places, announcing to the gods that he had finally united the empire, and he erected stone tablets with ritual inscriptions to extol his achievements. Another motive for Qin Shi Huang's travels was his interest in magic and alchemy and his search for masters in these arts who could provide him with the elixir of immortality. After the failure of such an expedition to the islands in the Eastern Sea, possibly Japan, in 219, the emperor repeatedly summoned magicians to his court. Confucian scholars strongly condemned this step as charlatanry, and it is said that 460 of them were executed for their opposition. The continuous controversy between the emperor and Confucian scholars who advocated a return to the old feudal order culminated in the famous burning of the books of 213, when, at Li's suggestion, all books not dealing with agriculture, medicine, or prognostication were burned, except historical records of Qin and books in the imperial library. The last years of Qin Shi Huang's life were dominated by an ever-growing distrust of his entourage. At least 3 assassination attempts nearly succeeded, and his increasing isolation from the common people. Almost inaccessible in his huge palaces, the emperor led the life of a semi-divine being. In 210 Qin Shi Huang died during an inspection tour. He was buried in a gigantic funerary compound hewn out of a mountain and shaped in conformity with the symbolic patterns of the cosmos. Excavation of this enormous complex of some 20 square miles, 50 square km, now known as the Qin Tomb, began in 1974, and the complex was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1987. Among the findings at the site were some 8,000 life-sized terracotta soldier and horse figures forming an army for the dead king. The disappearance of Qin Shi Huang's forceful personality immediately led to the outbreak of fighting among supporters of the old feudal factions that ended in the collapse of the Qin dynasty and the extermination of the entire imperial clan by 206. Most of the information about Qin Shi Huang's life derives from the successor Han dynasty, which prized Confucian scholarship and thus had an interest in disparaging the Qin period. The report that Qin Shi Huang was an illegitimate son of Lu Bouvet is possibly an invention of that epoch. Further, stories describing his excessive cruelty and the general defamation of his character must be viewed in the light of the distaste felt by the ultimately victorious Confucians for legalist philosophy in general. Qin Shi Huang certainly had an imposing personality and showed an unbending will in pursuing his aim of uniting and strengthening the empire. His despotic rule and the draconian punishments he meted out were dictated largely by his belief in legalist ideas. With few exceptions, the traditional historiography of imperial China has regarded him as the villain par excellence, unhuman, uncultivated, and superstitious. Modern historians, however, generally stress the endurance of the bureaucratic and administrative structure institutionalized by Qin Shi Huang, which, despite its official denial, remained the basis of all subsequent dynasties in China. We wouldn't have a China without Qin Shi Huang, says Harvard University's Peter Boal. I think it's that simple. China at the time was a land of many states. In many ways, climate, lifestyle, diet, someone from northern Scotland and southern Spain have as much in common as someone from China's frozen north and the tropical south. Before Qin, China's multiple states were diverging, rather than converging, says Boal. They have different calendars, their writing was starting to vary, the road widths were different, so the axle width is different in different places. He was king of the small state of Qin by the age of 13, and started as he meant to go on, removing one possible threat to his throne by having his mother's lover executed, along with his entire clan. 100 years later, the famous historian Sima Qian said of the young king, with his puffed out chest like a hawk and voice of a jackal, Qin is a man of scant mercy who has the heart of a wolf. When he is in difficulty, he readily humbles himself before others, but when he has got his way, then he thinks nothing of eating others alive. If the king should ever get his way with the world, then the whole world will end up his prisoner. Qin Shi Huang built a formidable fighting machine. His army is easy to imagine because he left us the famous terracotta warriors in Jian. The Qin was really the first state to really go into total mobilization for war, says Peter Boal. It really saw the work of its population being fighting and soldiering to win wars and expand. One by one, Qin Shi Huang defeated neighboring states, swallowed their territory into his growing empire and enslaved and castrated their citizens. Every time he captured people from another country, he castrated them in order to mark them and made them into slaves, says Hong Kong University's Zhou. There were lots and lots of eunuchs in his court. He was a ruthless tyrant. But still, no Qin, no China. From Mongolia down to Hong Kong, and from the sea right the way across to Sichuan, it's an enormous territory, says Francis Wood, curator of the Chinese collection at the British Library. It's the equivalent of the whole Roman Empire added together, if you like. And you've got one man ruling all of it. Peter Boal credits Qin Shi Huang not only with creating China, but with establishing the world's first truly centralized bureaucratic empire. He set out to unify the procedures and customs and policies of all the states, says Boal. Writing is reunified. And the fact that Chinese writing remains unified after this point has everything to do with Qin Shi Huang. The axle widths are now all the same, so all the roads may now be passable. He also goes around to famous mountains, where they erect skulls, stone monuments, which say that the emperor's realm is now totally unified. His idea was that every area should have an able administrator, who was armed with rule books and who would look after the people. The people all knew what the rules were, says Wood. He collected taxes, he administered justice, and he had trained bureaucrats all over China. I think that's an extraordinary achievement. Despite this, it is the stories of his bloodletting that historian Zhou grew up with. He got rid of anybody who showed opposition or didn't agree with him. He was paranoid. He was constantly in fear of how he could control this vast new territory with so many cultures and so many different groups of people, she says. And he feared the inkbrush as much as the sword. The scholars were talking behind his back, says Zhou. And of course, being a paranoid person, he didn't like that. So he ordered the arrest of over 400 scholars and buried them. Qin Shi Huang had no truck with China's traditions of Confucian scholarship. His fear of the intellectual was deep-rooted. Ideologically speaking, the Qin make the argument, we don't want to hear people criticize the present by referring to the past, says Peter Bole. The past is irrelevant. History is irrelevant. And so you have the burning of books, you have the burying of scholars, of scholarly critics. Bole sees parallels with today's China. Like Qin Shi Huang, the Communist Party tolerates debate about tactics, but not about the general direction of travel, he says. They argue that it is the only possible approach to governing China. Historian Zhang Zhou agrees. In Communist China, we adopted the imperial model. The emperor is absolute. And the only way to rule such a vast empire is ruthlessness, she says. In fact, in 1958, Mao himself made the connection between himself and Qin Shi Huang. He buried 460 scholars alive. We have buried 46,000 scholars alive, he said in a speech to party cadres. You intellectuals revile us for being Qin Shi Huangs. You are wrong. We have surpassed Qin Shi Huang 100-fold. Every night, Mo's body inside its crystal coffin reportedly goes down into its earthquake-proof vault in an elevator, and every morning it is brought back up again. It is probably something Qin Shi Huang would have appreciated. But I am not sure he would have been impressed with Mo's mausoleum. His includes a life-size terracotta army, a full orchestra with instruments and a river landscape with cranes, swans and geese, and archaeologists have barely begun the excavation. In a sense, the man has disappeared behind the tomb, says Francis Wood. And of course, the size of the buried army, the size of the tomb enclosure, which seems to expand daily, does rather overcome anything that one knows about him in reality. You've got this great physical presence now. Both Qin Shi Huang and Mao live on powerfully in China's imagination, but China is bigger than its emperors. When Qin Shi Huang died, his dynasty lasted only months. It was the idea of China which survived. And when Mao died, his successors said the radiance of his thought would live forever. But the Mao suits are gone, and despite the crowds at his mausoleum, Maoism is barely mentioned today.